There is a species of marketing that does not announce itself. It does not arrive through banner advertisements, press junkets, or algorithmic recommendation engines. It arrives instead through the architecture of disagreement, through the careful construction of a cultural object so loaded with intersecting tensions, racial, gendered, political, ideological, that the mere act of encountering it produces an almost involuntary need to speak, to process, to declare a position, and in the declaring, to advertise. This is the machinery operating beneath the surface of A24’s The Drama, and it represents something that traditional marketing scholarship has not yet fully named. We might call it discourse metastasis. The term borrows from oncology, and deliberately so. In medicine, metastasis describes the process by which cancerous cells break away from their origin site and colonize distant parts of the body. The cells do not need permission to spread. They do not require a centralized command structure. They replicate because their architecture is designed for replication. The parallel to cultural discourse is almost exact. When a film, a product, a brand object is constructed with the right combination of unresolved tensions, the discourse it generates behaves like a metastatic agent. It breaks away from the original site of the film itself and colonizes social media timelines, group chats, podcast episodes, opinion columns, academic seminars, and dinner table arguments. Each new site of discourse becomes a secondary marketing node, generating attention, engagement, and ultimately economic value for the original object. This is not word-of-mouth marketing, which assumes a positive consumer experience being voluntarily shared. This is something structurally different. Discourse metastasis does not require the consumer to have enjoyed the product. It does not even require the consumer to have consumed the product. It requires only that the product exists within a field of sufficient cultural tension that encountering information about it triggers a response. Agreement, disagreement, outrage, defense, analysis, satire. All of these responses function identically from the perspective of the marketing architecture. They all generate attention, they all drive awareness, they all create the conditions under which a person who has not yet seen the film feels socially compelled to see it, if only to participate in the discourse. The genius of A24’s approach with the drama is that this was not accidental. The film was engineered, from its casting decisions to its narrative architecture to its marketing rollout, as a discourse generation engine. Let us begin with the most foundational element, the choice to cast Zendaya as Emma Harwood. This is not a casting decision in the traditional sense. It is a go-to-market strategy disguised as an artistic choice. To understand why, we must first understand what Zendaya represents in the contemporary American cultural economy. Zendaya is not merely an actress. She occupies a position that is better described using the language of institutional economics than the language of Hollywood talent management. She is what we might call a cultural intermediary institution, a living, breathing node through which multiple identity categories, consumer demographics, and aspirational narratives converge. She is biracial in a way that activates racial discourse without requiring the film to explicitly address race. She is a fashion icon whose red carpet appearances generate their own news cycles independent of whatever film she is promoting. She is a figure of feminine aspiration who operates across racial boundaries. White women, black women, Latina women, and women of various mixed-race identities can all project themselves onto her without encountering a hard, categorical boundary that forces them to acknowledge difference. This is not a minor detail. It is the single most important structural feature of the casting decision because it means that any narrative involving Zendaya automatically imports a set of identity tensions that would otherwise need to be written into the script, performed by the actors, and processed by the audience through explicit dialogue. By casting Zendaya, the film gains access to these tensions for free. They arrive as what economists would call externalities, effects that are produced by the casting decision, but are not contained within the formal boundaries of the film's script or direction. The racial dimension of Emma's character, for instance, is never explicitly addressed in the screenplay. The script, reportedly, was written for a white woman. But by placing Zendaya in the role, every interaction between Emma and the other characters becomes legible through a racial lens without anyone having to speak the word race. When Rachel, played by Alana Haim, recoils from Emma's revelation and becomes hostile, that hostility can be read by different audiences through entirely different frameworks. A white feminist viewer might see Rachel as representing a kind of moral rigidity, an inability to hold complexity. A black feminist viewer might see Rachel as enacting a specific form of white feminine violence, the way white women weaponize moral purity against black and biracial women, using the rhetoric of safety and victimhood to exclude and punish. A viewer interested in criminal justice might see Rachel as embodying the carceral instinct, the impulse to permanently define a person by their worst potential action. And a viewer interested in disability studies might notice that Rachel's cousin Sam, a wheelchair-using mass shooting survivor, functions as a moral trump card that Rachel deploys to shut down any possibility of nuance or forgiveness. Each of these readings is valid. Each of them is productive for the film's discourse economy. And critically, each of them is enabled not by the screenplay, but by the casting decision. Had Emma been played by a white actress, the racial reading would disappear entirely, and with it, a massive portion of the film's discourse-generating capacity. Rachel would simply be a woman who cannot handle moral complexity. The feminist dimension would flatten into a generic disagreement between two white women about the ethics of forgiveness. The intersectional reading, the one that drives the most passionate, the most viral, the most sustained online discourse, would be structurally impossible. This is where we begin to see the economic logic of discourse metastasis. In traditional marketing, a firm allocates resources to generate attention. It buys media placement, hires publicists, creates trailers, and manages social media accounts. The cost of attention acquisition is a direct function of the firm's marketing budget. But discourse metastasis operates on an entirely different economic model. The firm does not pay for the discourse. The discourse pays for itself. Each person who posts on X about whether Rachel's treatment of Emma has racial undertones is performing unpaid marketing labor. Each podcast that dedicates 20 minutes to debating whether the film humanizes school shooters is generating media impressions that A24 did not purchase. Each academic who writes a think piece about the intersection of race, gender, and violence in the film is producing content that extends the film's presence in the cultural conversation far beyond what any paid marketing campaign could achieve. The economic term for this is network externalities. The value of the product increases as more people engage with it, and each new engagement creates the conditions for further engagement. But network externalities typically describe products whose value increases with the number of users, like a telephone network or a social media platform. What discourse metastasis describes is something different and more radical. A product whose marketing value increases with the number of people arguing about it, regardless of whether those people have consumed the product or even intend to. The film becomes a Schelling focal point, a concept from game theory describing a solution that people converge on in the absence of communication simply because it is salient. The drama becomes the thing people talk about, not because they have all agreed to talk about it, but because its construction makes it impossible to talk about anything else in adjacent cultural conversations. If you are having a conversation about race in America, the drama becomes relevant. If you are having a conversation about feminism, the drama becomes relevant. If you are having a conversation about gun violence, school shootings, forgiveness, criminal justice, or even wedding culture, the drama becomes relevant. It has colonized multiple discourse territories simultaneously, and each territory feeds attention back to the original object. Now, let us examine the second layer of the discourse metastasis architecture, the narrative structure itself. The film's central plot device, Emma's revelation that she once planned a school shooting as a teenager, is not merely a dramatic twist. It is a discourse accelerant. School shootings occupy a unique position in the American cultural landscape. They are simultaneously one of the most discussed and one of the most unresolved political issues in the country. They activate deep emotional responses across the political spectrum. They implicate questions of gun control, mental health, educational policy, racial profiling, and the nature of violence itself. By placing this topic at the center of a romantic drama, the film creates what we might call categorical dissonance, the uncomfortable collision of two cultural categories that are not supposed to coexist. Romance and school shootings do not belong in the same sentence. The film forces them together, and the discomfort this produces is itself a discourse engine. People cannot encounter this combination without feeling compelled to articulate a response. The phrase manic pixie school shooter used by the Slate Review is a perfect example of how categorical dissonance produces discourse. The phrase is funny and horrifying simultaneously. It captures in 3 words the exact nature of the film's transgression, the application of a romantic comedy archetype to a figure associated with mass violence. The phrase went viral, not because it was a good piece of criticism, but because it crystallized a tension that the film had engineered. It gave people something to react to, share, quote, argue about. It became a meme, which is to say, it became a unit of discourse metastasis. The marketing rollout itself was designed to accelerate this process. A24’s decision to market the film exclusively as a romantic comedy about a wedding, complete with wedding-coded fashion on the press tour, a pop-up wedding chapel in Las Vegas, and engagement announcement-style advertisements in the Boston Globe, created what intelligence agencies call a deception operation. The audience was led to believe they were consuming one type of product, a lighthearted wedding film, only to discover they had purchased something entirely different, a dark exploration of violence, guilt, and moral judgment. This bait and switch is not merely clever marketing. It is a structural feature of the discourse metastasis model. The gap between expectation and reality produces what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a state of psychological discomfort that humans are motivated to resolve through either attitude change or information seeking. In this case, the information seeking takes the form of discourse. People who felt deceived by the marketing needed to process that deception publicly, which generated more discourse, which generated more awareness, which generated more ticket sales. March for Our Lives criticized the marketing as misleading. Tom Mauser, father of a Columbine victim, criticized the film for humanizing school shooters. These criticisms were not obstacles to the film's commercial success. They were features of its marketing architecture. Each criticism generated news coverage, each news story generated social media discussion, and each social media discussion created another node in the metastatic network. We can formalize this into a mathematical framework. Let D represent the total volume of discourse generated by the film. Let C represent the number of cultural categories the film activates: race, gender, gun violence, romance, class, disability, forgiveness, criminal justice, and so on. Let T represent the degree of tension within each category, measured as the distance between the most extreme positions available within that category. And let I represent the intersectionality coefficient, the degree to which the categories overlap and interact, producing compound tensions that are greater than the sum of their parts. Then D is proportional to C multiplied by T multiplied by I. This is the discourse metastasis equation. The drama achieves an extraordinarily high value of D because it maximizes all three variables simultaneously. It activates an unusually large number of cultural categories, high C. Each category contains a high degree of unresolved tension in American society, high T, and the categories interact with each other in ways that compound the tension exponentially, high I. The racial and gender dimensions interact, producing discourse about how black and biracial women are perceived differently when associated with violence. The romance and violence dimensions interact, producing discourse about whether love and forgiveness can coexist with moral horror. The class and criminal justice dimensions interact, producing discourse about who gets to be rehabilitated and who is permanently defined by their worst moment. Each interaction multiplies the discourse output, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that extends the film's cultural presence far beyond what its box office performance alone would suggest. This framework has profound implications beyond film marketing. It suggests that any cultural product, a brand launch, a political campaign, a social movement, a startup's positioning strategy, can be engineered for discourse metastasis by maximizing C, T, and I. A product that activates multiple cultural categories, positions itself within unresolved tensions, and creates intersectional compound effects will generate disproportionate attention relative to its intrinsic qualities or its marketing budget. The product does not need to be good. It does not need to be bad. It needs only to be loaded, constructed in such a way that encountering it produces an almost involuntary need to speak. This is what the drama achieved, and it represents a genuinely new paradigm in the economics of cultural production. The old model assumed that attention was a resource that firms purchased and allocated. The new model recognizes that attention is a resource that can be cultivated, grown organically through the strategic construction of cultural objects that are optimized not for consumption but for discourse. The product is not the film. The product is the argument about the film. And the argument, unlike the film, has no runtime. It plays in perpetuity across every platform, in every language, in every context where the tensions it activates remain unresolved, which, in America, means forever. There is a deeper philosophical dimension here that connects to the work of Jean Baudrillard on simulation and simulacra. Baudrillard argued that in postmodern consumer societies, the distinction between the real and the representation collapses. The map precedes the territory. The simulation becomes more real than the thing it simulates. Discourse metastasis represents a specific application of this principle to marketing. The discourse about the film becomes more real, more culturally present, more economically valuable, more socially consequential than the film itself. Most of the people participating in the discourse about the drama have not seen the film. They are arguing about a representation of the film, a representation constructed through trailers, reviews, social media posts, podcast discussions, and their own projections. The film exists as what Baudrillard would call a hyper-real object, something that generates effects in the real world without itself being directly experienced by most of the people affected by those effects. This is not a failure of the marketing. This is the marketing. The hyper-real version of the film, the version that exists in discourse rather than in theaters, is the actual product. The theatrical version is merely the seed crystal around which the hyper-real version nucleates. This has implications for how we understand the relationship between production and consumption in the contemporary cultural economy. In the traditional model, a firm produces a product, markets the product, and consumers consume the product. Value is created at the point of consumption. But in the discourse metastasis model, value is created at the point of discourse, which is structurally independent of consumption. A person who has never seen the drama, but has spent 45 minutes arguing about it on X, has generated more marketing value for A24 than a person who saw the film in silence and told no one. This inverts the entire logic of the cultural economy. The most valuable consumer is not the one who consumes the most, but the one who discourses the most. And the most valuable product is not the one that is consumed the most, but the one that is argued about the most. This is why the drama's mixed critical reception, 77% on Rotten Tomatoes with reviews ranging from enthusiastic to hostile, is not a commercial liability, but a commercial asset. A film with unanimous critical acclaim generates less discourse than a film with deeply polarized reception. Unanimity produces consensus, and consensus is the death of discourse. Polarization produces conflict, and conflict is the fuel of discourse metastasis. A24 understands this intuitively, which is why its entire brand identity is built around films that provoke rather than please. Hereditary, Midsummer, The Killing of a Sacred Deer, Uncut Gems. These are all films that were designed, at a structural level, to generate disproportionate discourse relative to their budgets. The drama is simply the most sophisticated iteration of this model to date. Let us now consider the political science dimension. In political theory, there is a concept called the Overton window, which describes the range of ideas that are considered acceptable in mainstream public discourse. Ideas inside the Overton window can be discussed openly. Ideas outside it are considered too extreme, too taboo, or too dangerous to be acknowledged. The drama operates by deliberately positioning its central narrative at the boundary of the Overton window. The idea of humanizing a would-be school shooter is, for many Americans, outside the window. It is not something that can be discussed openly without provoking moral outrage. By forcing this idea into a mainstream cultural product, a romantic comedy starring two of the most popular young actors in Hollywood, the film does not move the Overton window. It creates what we might call a discourse fault line, a zone of maximum cultural stress, where the pressure between what can and cannot be discussed publicly produces the greatest amount of discursive energy. This is the same principle that operates in seismology. Earthquakes occur not in the middle of tectonic plates, but at the boundaries where plates collide. Cultural earthquakes, viral moments, national controversies, paradigm-shifting conversations occur at the boundaries of what is and is not sayable. The drama positions itself precisely at this boundary, and the discursive earthquake it produces is the marketing. The sociological implications are equally profound. Emile Durkheim's concept of collective effervescence describes the heightened emotional energy that occurs when a community gathers around a shared symbol or ritual. Traditionally, this concept has been applied to religious ceremonies, political rallies, and sporting events. But discourse metastasis produces a digital form of collective effervescence, a distributed, asynchronous, platform-mediated version of the same phenomenon. When millions of people simultaneously engage in discourse about the drama, they experience a form of collective emotional intensity that binds them together not around the film itself, but around the discourse about the film. The discourse becomes the ritual. The film becomes the sacred object around which the ritual is organized. And the emotional energy generated by the ritual, the outrage, the passion, the moral certainty, the intellectual excitement, is the currency that powers the entire marketing architecture. This is what makes discourse metastasis fundamentally different from traditional viral marketing, buzz marketing, or word-of-mouth marketing. Those frameworks assume that the product generates positive consumer experiences that are then shared voluntarily. Discourse metastasis makes no such assumption. It recognizes that the most powerful driver of cultural attention is not satisfaction, but tension. Not agreement, but disagreement. Not resolution, but irresolution. The drama is a commercially successful film, not because audiences loved it, but because audiences could not stop arguing about it. And they could not stop arguing about it because it was engineered at every level of its construction. Casting, narrative, marketing, release timing, to activate the maximum number of unresolved cultural tensions simultaneously. This is the new frontier of marketing science, and it demands a new vocabulary, a new set of mathematical models, and a new understanding of the relationship between cultural production and economic value. The drama is not merely a film, it is a proof of concept for a marketing paradigm that will define the next decade of cultural production. The firms, the creators, and the political actors who understand this paradigm will dominate the attention economy. Those who do not will continue to buy advertisements and wonder why no one is talking about them. We must also examine the temporal architecture of discourse metastasis, as it operated specifically with the drama. Traditional film marketing follows a linear timeline: teaser, trailer, press tour, premiere, opening weekend, and then a rapid decay of public attention as the next cultural product arrives. Discourse metastasis disrupts this temporal structure entirely. The attention generated by the drama does not follow a decay curve. It follows what complexity theorists would call a punctuated equilibrium pattern, periods of relatively stable discourse interrupted by sudden spikes triggered by new provocations. A celebrity tweets about the film, a shooting occurs in the real world and someone connects it to the film's narrative. A university professor assigns the film in a gender studies course, and the syllabus goes viral. Each of these events represents a new nucleation point for discourse, and each nucleation point can generate its own cascade of secondary and tertiary discourse events. The result is a cultural half-life that is orders of magnitude longer than what traditional film marketing produces. 6 months after its release, people will still be arguing about the drama. Not because it is a great film, the critical consensus is divided on that question, but because the cultural tensions it activates are themselves permanent features of American society. As long as America has unresolved conflicts about race, gender, gun violence, and forgiveness, the drama will remain a relevant discourse object. The film has achieved what we might call cultural escape velocity, the point at which a cultural product generates enough discourse momentum to sustain itself indefinitely without additional marketing expenditure. Consider also the gendered dimension of the discourse metastasis architecture. The film is fundamentally about how different characters process a moral revelation, and those processing patterns break along gendered lines in ways that are both deliberate and commercially productive. Charlie, the male protagonist, processes Emma's revelation through anxiety, paranoia, and a deteriorating capacity for intimacy. His response is coded as masculine, internal, self-destructive, performatively rational but emotionally chaotic. Rachel, by contrast, processes the same revelation through moral certainty, social punishment, and the weaponization of her cousin Sam's disability status as a rhetorical trump card. Her response is coded as a specific kind of white, feminine moral absolutism, the kind that deploys victimhood as a form of social control. These gendered processing patterns produce gendered discourse patterns in the audience. Male viewers tend to identify with Charlie's confusion and paralysis. Female viewers tend to split along lines that track closely with their relationship to feminism, race, and moral philosophy. Women who subscribe to what might be called carceral feminism, the belief that safety requires the permanent identification and exclusion of potentially dangerous individuals, tend to side with Rachel. Women who subscribe to restorative or abolitionist frameworks, the belief that rehabilitation and forgiveness are possible even for the most serious offenses, tend to side with Emma. And women who occupy the intersectional space between these positions, particularly black and biracial women who have experienced the specific form of moral policing that Rachel directs at Emma, tend to read the entire film as a dramatization of how white feminism operates as a mechanism of racial control. This gendered discourse fragmentation is not a flaw in the film's design. It is the central feature of its marketing architecture. Each fragment produces its own discourse community, each community produces its own content, and each piece of content functions as a marketing asset for the film. The film does not need a unified audience. It needs a fragmented one, because fragmentation produces discourse, and discourse produces revenue. There is a final dimension that deserves attention, the role of A24 itself as a brand within the discourse metastasis architecture. A24 has spent a decade building a brand identity that is synonymous with cultural provocation. Films like Hereditary, Moonlight, Uncut Gems, and Everything Everywhere All at Once have trained audiences to expect a specific kind of experience from A24. Intellectually challenging, emotionally intense, aesthetically distinctive, and culturally divisive. This brand expectation creates a pre-existing discourse infrastructure that any new A24 film can plug into. When the drama was announced, it did not need to build its discourse infrastructure from scratch. It inherited the discourse infrastructure that A24 had been building for years. A24's brand functions as what network theorists call a hub node, a highly connected node in a network that amplifies the signal of anything connected to it. By releasing the drama through A24, rather than a traditional studio, the film immediately gained access to a pre-existing audience of cultural commentators, film critics, podcast hosts, and social media influencers who are primed to engage with A24 products. This is brand leverage at its most sophisticated, the use of accumulated brand equity, not to sell a product directly, but to amplify the discourse-generating capacity of the product, which then sells itself through the mechanism we have been describing throughout this section. This brings us to the ultimate insight of the discourse metastasis framework. The most powerful marketing strategy available in the contemporary cultural economy is not to sell a product. It is to construct a cultural object that is so richly loaded with unresolved tensions that it generates its own marketing through the discourse it provokes. The object does not need to be consumed to generate value. It does not need to be praised to generate value. It does not even need to be understood to generate value. It needs only to exist at the intersection of enough cultural fault lines that, encountering it, even secondhand, even through a friend's social media post or a headline glimpsed in passing, triggers an involuntary discursive response. The drama is not a film that happens to generate discourse. It is a discourse engine that happens to take the form of a film. And in the attention economy of the 21st century, that distinction is worth more than any advertising budget could buy. What we are witnessing, then, is the emergence of a post-advertising paradigm in cultural marketing. The old paradigm assumed a linear relationship between marketing expenditure and consumer attention. Spend more, get more attention. The new paradigm recognizes that the relationship between expenditure and attention is mediated by discourse, and that discourse can be cultivated rather than purchased. The firms that master this paradigm will not be the ones with the largest marketing budgets. They will be the ones with the deepest understanding of cultural tension, the ability to read the fault lines of a society and construct products that sit precisely at the points of maximum stress. A24 has demonstrated this capability with The Drama, and the results speak for themselves. A film with a modest production budget has generated a cultural footprint that dwarfs films with 10 times the marketing spend. The discourse metastasis model does not replace traditional marketing. It transcends it. And in doing so, it reveals something fundamental about the nature of attention in the 21st century. Attention is not a commodity that can be bought. It is a phenomenon that can be provoked. The drama provoked it, and the world responded. There is a mechanism operating in the perception economy that has no formal name in the academic literature, yet it governs an extraordinary portion of how human beings assign value, quality, and meaning to the objects, institutions, and people they encounter. We are going to name it here. We are going to call it the category context perception engine, and we are going to demonstrate that it is one of the most powerful and least understood forces in marketing, economics, sociology, and the philosophy of value itself. The principle is deceptively simple, almost embarrassingly so, and yet its implications ramify outward into every domain of human evaluation. The principle is this: the perceived quality of an entity is not a fixed property of the entity itself, but a function of the category against which it is measured. Change the category, and you change the perception. Change the perception, and you change the value. Change the value, and you change everything. The economic return, the cultural status, the social power, the narrative meaning, everything. And the entity itself has not changed at all. Let us begin with the example that makes this principle viscerally legible before we formalize it into a framework with mathematical and philosophical rigor. Consider Buc-ee's. For those unfamiliar, Buc-ee's is a chain of gas stations and travel centers headquartered in Texas that has expanded across the American South and beyond. Buc-ee's is enormous. Its locations are often 60,000 square feet or more. It sells an extraordinary range of products: barbecue, fudge, beef jerky, kolaches, branded merchandise, home goods, seasonal decorations, clothing, and an almost absurdist variety of snack foods. It has immaculate restrooms that have won actual awards. It has a cult following. People plan road trips around Buc-ee's stops. There are social media accounts dedicated to ranking Buc-ee's products. There is an entire subculture of Buc-ee's enthusiasm that borders on religious devotion. Now here is the critical question: is Buc-ee's good? The answer depends entirely on what category you place it in. If you categorize Buc-ee's as a grocery store, it is objectively terrible. The produce selection is non-existent. The dairy section is laughable. You cannot buy fresh vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, or any of the staple items that define a functional grocery store. The nutritional profile of its inventory skews overwhelmingly toward processed, high-sugar, high-sodium convenience foods. By every metric that defines a quality grocery store — freshness, variety, nutritional balance, price-to-quality ratio on staple goods — Buc-ee's sits in the bottom percentile. It is not a mediocre grocery store. It is a catastrophically bad one, but nobody categorizes Buc-ee's as a grocery store. They categorize it as a gas station. And against the comparison set of gas stations, the flickering fluorescent purgatory of a typical Shell station, the sticky-floored sadness of a roadside Chevron, the existential bleakness of a rural quick trip at 2 a.m, Buc-ee's is not merely good, it is transcendent. It is a revelation. It is the Sistine Chapel ceiling of gas stations. The exact same inventory, the exact same physical space, the exact same operational model, evaluated against 2 different categories, produces 2 entirely opposite judgments of quality. In one category, it is failure. In the other, it is excellence. And nothing about the entity itself changed, only the frame. This is the category context perception engine at work, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It is operating everywhere. It is operating in how we evaluate people, products, institutions, performances, ideas, and entire nations. It is operating in how Zendaya is perceived as an actress. And this is the connection to the drama and to the broader case study we are constructing across these 10 sections. But before we arrive at that application, we must first build the theoretical architecture with the rigor it demands, because this framework, properly formalized, has the potential to reorganize significant portions of marketing science, behavioral economics, organizational theory, and the philosophy of value. Let us begin with the economics. In classical economic theory, value is understood as either intrinsic, a property of the object itself, as in the labor theory of value, or subjective, a function of individual preferences, as in marginal utility theory. The category context. Perception engine suggests a third possibility that is neither purely intrinsic nor purely subjective. It suggests that value is categorical, that the perceived quality and worth of an entity is determined not by its inherent properties or by individual preferences alone, but by the category against which those properties are evaluated. This is a structural theory of value, meaning that value is not located in the object or in the subject, but in the relationship between the object and the categorical frame through which it is perceived. This has profound implications. If value is categorical, then value can be manufactured, not by changing the object, but by changing the category. This is precisely what Bookie's has done. It has not built a better grocery store, it has built a gas station and then expanded the scope of what a gas station can contain until the gap between the category expectation and the actual experience is so vast that the experience registers as extraordinary. The value is located in the gap, not in the product. We can formalize this. Let Q represent the perceived quality of an entity. Let P represent the actual performance or capability of the entity across relevant dimensions. Let E represent the expected performance associated with the category in which the entity is placed. Then Q is proportional to the ratio of P to E. When P over E is greater than 1, when actual performance exceeds categorical expectation, the entity is perceived as excellent. When P over E equals 1, the entity is perceived as adequate. When P over E is less than 1, the entity is perceived as deficient. The critical insight is that Q can be increased in two ways: by increasing P, which is the traditional approach to quality improvement, or by decreasing E, which is the category context approach. Decreasing E means placing the entity in a category with lower expectations so that the same level of actual performance registers as a greater degree of excellence. This is not deception, this is framing. And framing, as Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated in their Nobel Prize-winning research on prospect theory, is one of the most powerful determinants of human judgment and decision-making. The mathematical structure becomes even more interesting when we consider what happens at the extremes. When E approaches 0, when the category expectation is essentially nothing, even a modest level of actual performance produces a Q value that approaches infinity. This is the Buck-Ease effect at its most extreme. Gas station restrooms have a categorical expectation that is so low it is practically subterranean. The expected experience is grime, malfunction, absence of soap, a lock that does not work, a smell that registers somewhere between industrial solvent and biological emergency. Against this expectation, a clean, well-lit, fully stocked restroom with granite countertops and an attendant who maintains it every 15 minutes does not merely exceed expectations, it shatters them. The Q value is astronomical, not because the restroom is objectively remarkable, any mid-range hotel achieves the same standard, but because the categorical expectation was so abysmally low that ordinary competence registers as magnificence. Now let us apply this framework to the performing arts, and specifically to acting, because this is where the connection to Zendaya and the drama becomes explicit and revelatory. The performing arts operate within a nested system of categories that most audiences are not consciously aware of, but that powerfully shape their perception of quality. When we evaluate an actor's performance, we are not evaluating it against a single universal standard of acting excellence. We are evaluating it against the categorical expectation associated with the type of performer we believe the actor to be. This is a crucial distinction that acting theory, film criticism, and even audience psychology research have largely failed to formalize. Consider two hypothetical performers. The first is known primarily as an actor, someone whose career, public identity, and cultural positioning are organized entirely around the craft of acting. When this person delivers a performance, the audience evaluates it against the full range of acting excellence. The comparison set includes Daniel Day-Lewis, Meryl Streep, Cate Blanchett, Denzel Washington, the entire pantheon of performers who have defined what the upper boundary of acting can look like. Against this comparison set, a performance must be genuinely extraordinary to register as excellent, because the categorical expectation is already extremely high. E is large, which means that P must be proportionally large for Q to exceed 1. The second hypothetical performer is known primarily as something other than an actor, a musician, a fashion icon, a cultural figure, an activist, a brand. When this person delivers an acting performance, the audience does not evaluate it against the full range of acting excellence. They evaluate it against the categorical expectation of a non-actor acting, and that categorical expectation is dramatically lower. The comparison set is not Meryl Streep. The comparison set is other musicians who have acted, other models who have acted, other cultural figures who have attempted the transition from their primary domain to the screen. Against this comparison set, which includes some genuinely terrible performances, even a competent, professional, emotionally engaged performance registers as extraordinary. The Q value is inflated not because the performance is objectively superior, but because the categorical expectation is objectively lower. This is the mechanism through which Zendaya's acting is perceived. And let us be precise here, because precision matters. The claim is not that Zendaya is a bad actress. The claim is that her cultural positioning creates a categorical context in which her acting is perceived as more extraordinary than it would be if she were evaluated against the same comparison set as a performer whose primary identity is acting. Zendaya's primary cultural identity is not actress. It is icon. She is a fashion icon, a beauty icon, a multicultural aspirational figure, an ambassador for luxury brands, a red carpet event unto herself, a figure whose Instagram posts generate the kind of media coverage that most actresses only receive for their actual film performances. When Zendaya acts, when she delivers a performance in Euphoria, or Challengers, or the drama, the audience receives that performance through the categorical frame of icon who is also acting, not the categorical frame of actress delivering a performance. The E-value is different, the comparison set is different, and therefore the perceived quality is different, even if the actual performance is identical. This is not unique to Zendaya. It is a structural pattern that recurs throughout the entertainment industry, and, more broadly, throughout any domain where individuals operate across multiple categories. Halle Berry is perhaps the most instructive historical parallel. Berry's cultural positioning in the 1990s and early 2000s was remarkably similar to Zendaya's today, a biracial woman who occupied a position of aspirational beauty and cultural intermediation, someone who is perceived first as a beauty icon and secondarily as an actress. When Berry won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Monsters Ball in 2002, the cultural response was disproportionate to the performance itself, not because the performance was bad, but because the categorical context amplified its perceived significance. A beauty icon delivering a raw, unglamorous, sexually explicit, emotionally devastating performance was evaluated not against the standard of what a great actress can do, but against the standard of what a beauty icon is expected to do. The gap between expectation and performance was enormous, and that gap is what the Academy was really rewarding. The Oscar was not for the best performance of the year in absolute terms. It was for the performance that produced the highest Q value, the greatest ratio of actual performance to categorical expectation. We can extend this analysis into what we might call the medical doctor-golfer paradigm, which is the metaphor that emerged in the original observation that sparked this entire case study. The paradigm is this: a person who is primarily identified as a medical doctor, but who also plays golf at a semi-professional level, will be perceived as an extraordinarily talented golfer, even if their actual golf performance would be considered merely average by the standards of professional golf. The reason is categorical. When the audience learns that this person is a doctor who also golfs, their categorical expectation drops to the level of a doctor golfing, not a golfer golfing. Against the comparison set of doctors who golf, weekend players with inconsistent swings and a tendency to lose balls in the rough, a semi-professional level of play looks transcendent. But place that same person on the PGA Tour, where the categorical expectation is set by the best golfers in the world, and their performance registers as entirely unremarkable. The implications for personal branding and career strategy are enormous. The category context. Perception engine suggests that the most effective strategy for maximizing perceived quality is not necessarily to improve actual performance, though that always helps, but to strategically manage the category against which your performance is evaluated. This is a form of what military strategists call terrain selection, the principle that the outcome of a battle is often determined not by the strength of the forces involved, but by the terrain on which the battle is fought. If you can choose the terrain, you can win with inferior forces. If you can choose the category, you can achieve the perception of excellence with ordinary performance. This is morally neutral. It is not inherently deceptive. It is a structural feature of how human perception works. And any individual, organization, or brand that fails to account for it is operating at a disadvantage against those who do. Let us now push this framework further into the domain of sociology, because the category context perception engine has implications that extend far beyond marketing and personal branding. It connects directly to Pierre Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital and field theory. Bourdieu argued that social life is organized into fields, relatively autonomous domains of activity, each with its own rules, hierarchies, and forms of capital. The literary field has its own criteria of excellence, the economic field has its own, the political field has its own, and individuals accumulate capital, cultural, social, economic, symbolic, that is valued differently in different fields. A person with high cultural capital in the academic field may have low cultural capital in the entertainment field, and vice versa. The category context. Perception. Engine can be understood as the micro-level mechanism through which Bourdieu's macro-level field theory operates. When an individual moves from one field to another, when a doctor enters the golf field, when a fashion icon enters the acting field, when a gas station enters the grocery field, they carry with them the capital and the categorical expectations of their origin field. The perception of their performance in the new field is shaped not by the criteria of the new field alone, but by the interaction between the two fields. The cross-field transfer creates a perception distortion that can either amplify or diminish the individual's perceived quality, depending on the relative status expectations of the two fields. In Zendaya's case, the cross-field transfer is amplifying. Her origin field, fashion, beauty, cultural iconography, is a high-status field with low expectations for acting performance. Her destination field, Film acting is a field with extremely high expectations for acting performance. The cross-field transfer produces a perception distortion in which her actual acting performance, which is professional and competent and emotionally engaged, is amplified by the low categorical expectation imported from her origin field. She is not being evaluated as an actress, she's being evaluated as an icon who acts. And the gap between those two evaluative frames is where the perception of transcendence is manufactured. This connects to a concept in cognitive psychology known as the contrast effect, the tendency for the perception of a stimulus to be influenced by the stimuli that surround it or precede it. A moderately warm day feels hot if it follows a week of cold weather. A moderately priced restaurant feels cheap if it is located next to a Michelin-starred establishment. A moderately skilled acting performance feels extraordinary if it is delivered by someone whose primary identity suggests they should not be able to act at all. The contrast effect is not a cognitive error. It is a structural feature of how the human perceptual system processes information. We do not evaluate things in isolation, we evaluate them in context, and context is determined by category. The category context perception engine is, at its foundation, a theory about how context shapes perception, and therefore how context can be strategically managed to shape the value that perception assigns. Now let us consider the philosophical implications, because they are genuinely destabilizing. If the perceived quality of an entity is not a fixed property of the entity, but a function of the category against which it is measured, then what is quality? Is there such a thing as objective quality, independent of categorical framing? The realist position would say yes, that a performance is good or bad regardless of who delivers it or what category the audience places it in. The anti-realist position would say no, that quality is entirely a social construction determined by the evaluative frameworks that communities bring to bear on the objects they encounter. The category context. Perception engine suggests a third position that is more nuanced than either of these. It suggests that entities have objective properties, measurable capabilities, demonstrable skills, quantifiable features, but that the value assigned to those properties is categorically mediated. The properties are real, the value is constructed. This means that quality is neither purely objective nor purely subjective. It is relational, a function of the relationship between the entity's actual properties and the categorical frame through which those properties are perceived. This relational theory of quality has immediate practical implications for marketing strategy. If quality is relational rather than absolute, then a firm's competitive strategy should not be limited to improving the absolute quality of its products. It should also include managing the categorical frame through which those products are perceived. This is what Buc-ee's does. It does not compete in the grocery category, where it would lose. It competes in the gas station category, where it dominates. And it does not merely passively accept its categorical placement. It actively reinforces it through branding, architecture, location strategy, and cultural positioning. Buc-ee's locations are always on highways. They always have gas pumps prominently displayed at the front. They always use the visual language of a gas station. The canopy, the pump islands, the convenience store footprint, even though the actual footprint is 10 times larger. These design choices are not incidental. They are categorical anchoring devices, cues that tell the consumer's perceptual system which category to activate when evaluating the experience. The gas pumps at the front are not primarily there to sell gas. They are there to tell your brain, this is a gas station. Evaluate accordingly. And when your brain evaluates a 60,000 square foot food and merchandise emporium against the standard of a gas station, the cue value explodes. This principle of categorical anchoring has applications far beyond retail. It applies to how nations are perceived on the world stage. A country categorized as developing that achieves even moderate institutional competence is celebrated, while a country categorized as developed that achieves the same level is criticized. It applies to how startups are evaluated. A 3-person garage operation that generates $1 million in revenue is a unicorn in waiting, while an established corporation that generates the same revenue is a rounding error. It applies to how students are evaluated. A first-generation college student who earns a 3.5 grade average is heroic, while a legacy student with the same grades is unremarkable. In every case, the perceived quality is not a function of the absolute performance, but of the ratio between performance and categorical expectation. The category context. Perception engine is universal. Let us return now to the drama, and to Zendaya specifically, because the film exploits the category context perception engine in a way that is commercially brilliant and structurally revealing. In the film, Zendaya plays Emma Harwood, a bookstore clerk from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who has moved to Boston and is about to marry Charlie, a British museum director. The character is written to operate in a register that is deliberately understated, quiet, watchful, emotionally contained, occasionally witty, but never performatively so. This is a smart character design for Zendaya specifically because it positions her actual performance capabilities in the zone where the category context perception engine maximizes cue. If the role had required extreme emotional pyrotechnics, the kind of sustained, virtuosic intensity that characterizes the work of performers like Viola Davis or Saoirse Ronan, the categorical expectation gap would have worked against Zendaya because the audience would have been forced to evaluate her against the highest standard of dramatic performance. But by keeping the role in a lower register, restraint, opacity, subtle emotional shifts communicated through body language rather than dialogue, the film positions Zendaya in the zone where icon who acts produces maximum perceived transcendence. The performance is real, the emotional engagement is genuine, but the perception of its quality is amplified by the categorical frame. The Roger Ebert review of The Drama, written by Robert Daniels, captures this dynamic perfectly without naming it. The review notes that Zendaya listens more than she speaks, that she communicates regret and fragility through the discreet way she holds her body, and that her internal choices move with assured agility across her face. This is a description of competent, emotionally intelligent screen acting. It is good work, but the reverence with which it is described, the near poetry of the critical language, tells us something about the categorical frame through which the reviewer is processing the performance. If the same performance had been delivered by an actress whose primary identity was actress, someone with a theater background, a filmography of challenging roles, a reputation built entirely on craft, the language of the review would likely have been appreciative but not reverential. It would have been good, not transcendent. The reverence is produced by the gap between what the reviewer expects from Zendaya's category and what Zendaya actually delivers. That gap is the category context perception engine in operation. There is a further dimension to this that connects to the economics of attention and the sociology of celebrity. The category context perception engine does not only affect how audiences perceive Zendaya's acting, it also affects how much attention her acting receives. An actress, known only as an actress, must compete for attention within the acting field, where the supply of talented performers is enormous and the demand for attention is distributed across thousands of films and television shows each year. But an icon who acts does not compete within the acting field alone. She competes within the iconography field, the fashion field, the beauty field, and the celebrity field simultaneously. Her acting receives attention from all of these fields because her performance in one field is news in all the others. When Zendaya delivers a performance in The Drama, it is reviewed not only by film critics, but by fashion journalists, celebrity gossip outlets, cultural commentators, and social media influencers whose primary interest is not cinema, but the broader Zendaya phenomenon. The cross-field attention multiplier means that a performance of moderate absolute quality generates disproportionate attention, which generates disproportionate discourse, which feeds back into the discourse metastasis architecture we described in Section 1. This reveals the deepest structural insight of the category context perception engine. It is not a static mechanism, but a dynamic one that interacts with other systems of value creation to produce compounding effects. The categorical framing amplifies the perceived quality of the performance. The amplified perceived quality generates increased attention from multiple fields. The increased attention generates increased discourse. The increased discourse generates increased cultural presence. The increased cultural presence reinforces and strengthens the categorical positioning that produced the amplification in the first place. It is a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop in the systems theory sense, a loop where the output of the system feeds back into the input in a way that amplifies the original signal. Zendaya's performance is perceived as transcendent because she is an icon. The perception of transcendence reinforces her status as an icon. Her reinforced iconic status further amplifies the perception of her next performance. And so on, indefinitely, in a self-reinforcing cycle that has no natural equilibrium point short of some external disruption that breaks the loop. This is why the category context perception engine is not merely a marketing insight. It is a power structure. It determines who gets to be perceived as excellent and who does not. It determines which products are celebrated and which are ignored. It determines which nations are praised for their governance and which are condemned. It determines which students are considered exceptional and which are considered ordinary. And it operates not through conspiracy or manipulation, but through the basic architecture of human perception. The inescapable fact that we evaluate everything in context, and context is determined by category. To control the category is to control the perception. To control the perception is to control the value. And to control the value is, in the deepest sense, to control reality itself. Not material reality, perceived reality, which, in a world where perception drives behavior, drives markets, drives elections, drives culture, and drives the allocation of attention, resources, and power, is the only reality that matters. This brings us to a final consideration that bridges the category context perception engine into the domain of political philosophy and critical theory. If the perception of quality is categorically constructed rather than objectively determined, then the question of who controls the categories becomes a question of power. Who decides that Buck E's is a gas station and not a grocery store? Who decides that Zendaya is an icon who acts? rather than an actress who is iconic? Who decides that a developing nation achieving moderate governance is admirable while a developed nation achieving the same is contemptible? The answer, in most cases, is that the categories are not controlled by any single agent, but emerge from the interaction of cultural narratives, institutional structures, media representation, and accumulated historical precedent. But they can be influenced, they can be strategically managed, and the agents who manage them most effectively, whether they are brands, individuals, nations, or political movements, gain a structural advantage in the perception economy that is nearly impossible to overcome through absolute performance alone. You cannot outperform a categorical disadvantage. You can only recategorize. This is the lesson of bookies. This is the lesson of Zendaya. And this is the lesson of the drama, which operates not only as a discourse engine, as we described in Section 1, but as a case study in how categorical framing can be deployed to manufacture the perception of transcendence from the raw material of competence. The drama is not a transcendent film. The critical consensus is clear on this. It is a good film with significant structural weaknesses elevated by strong performances and provocative subject matter. But it is perceived as transcendent, as a cultural event, as a conversation-defining artifact, as a landmark in the careers of its leads, because the categorical frame through which it is evaluated amplifies its actual qualities beyond their absolute magnitude. It is an A24 film which imports the categorical expectation of indie provocation and artistic ambition. It stars Zendaya, which imports the categorical expectation of iconic cultural significance. It addresses school shootings, which imports the categorical expectation of courage and social relevance. Against the combined categorical expectation produced by these overlapping frames, even a moderately successful execution registers as extraordinary. The Q value is not a reflection of the film, it is a reflection of the frame, and the frame, as we have now demonstrated, is everything. There is a casting decision at the center of the drama that operates as something far more consequential than an artistic choice. It is a market architecture decision disguised as a creative one, and its implications extend into the deepest structures of how race, gender, perception, and economic value interact in the American cultural economy. The decision to cast Zendaya as Emma Harwood, a character reportedly written as white, a bookstore clerk from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who confesses to having planned a school shooting as a teenager, does not merely add a racial dimension to the film. It fundamentally restructures the entire interpretive architecture of the narrative, multiplies the number of audience entry points by an order of magnitude, and creates a form of identity-based market segmentation that traditional demographic targeting could never achieve. We are going to call this phenomenon racial ambiguity as go-to-market strategy, and we are going to demonstrate that it represents one of the most sophisticated and least theorized mechanisms of value creation in contemporary cultural production. Let us begin with what the transcript reveals about Emma as a character, because the specifics matter enormously. Emma Harwood is introduced through Charlie's retelling of their meet cute at a coffee shop. She is reading a book. Charlie, nervous and smitten, pretends to have read the same book to initiate conversation. She is deaf in one ear, a detail that creates an immediate moment of awkward intimacy when she cannot hear his initial approach and offers him a chance to start over. This is a character whose defining qualities, as presented in the opening minutes, are warmth, generosity, quiet self-possession, and a willingness to extend grace to a fumbling stranger. She calls him a weird little British freak, but she says it with affection. She is, in every respect, coded as likable, approachable, and non-threatening. Later, when she reveals to Charlie and their friends at the wine tasting that she once planned a school shooting, the revelation lands with the force it does precisely because it contradicts everything the audience has been trained to associate with this character. She is kind, she is empathetic. She tells Charlie she loves that he is smart, caring, open-minded, and understanding. She diffuses his workplace anxiety by turning his drama into comedy. She is, in the language of romantic comedy, the dream partner. And she once brought her father's rifle to school with the intention of killing her classmates. Now, here is the critical question that the film's racial architecture makes possible, and that would be structurally impossible if Emma were played by a white actress, who's allowed to be forgiven, who's allowed to have been dangerous and still be loved, who's allowed to have contained violence and still be perceived as aspirational. These questions, in America, are never racially neutral. They are never asked in a vacuum. They are always asked through the lens of a racial perception system that assigns different default assumptions to different bodies. And Zendaya's body, biracial, racially ambiguous, simultaneously legible as black and as not quite black, as mixed and as universal, activates this entire perception system without the film ever having to name it. This is what makes the casting decision a go-to-market strategy, rather than merely a creative choice. In marketing, a go-to-market strategy refers to the comprehensive plan through which a product reaches its target customers. It encompasses positioning, messaging, channel strategy, pricing, and the identification of the specific customer segments the product is designed to serve. Traditionally, go-to-market strategies in the film industry are developed by marketing departments after the film is produced. The product is made, and then the strategy for reaching audiences is designed around it. What the drama represents is something structurally different, a go-to-market strategy that is embedded in the product itself at the level of casting, so that the product arrives in the market already optimized for multi-segment penetration. By casting Zendaya, the film does not need a separate strategy for reaching black audiences, white audiences, biracial audiences, feminist audiences, or fashion-forward audiences. The casting decision is the strategy. It segments the market at the point of production rather than at the point of distribution. Let us formalize this. In traditional market segmentation theory, a firm identifies distinct customer segments, develops products or messaging tailored to each segment, and deploys resources to reach each segment through appropriate channels. The cost of multi-segment targeting is proportional to the number of segments. More segments require more tailored messaging, more channel strategies, more creative assets. But Zendaya's racial ambiguity collapses this cost structure. She is what we might call a polymorphic market asset, a single casting element that is perceived differently by different audience segments, generating segment-specific value without segment-specific investment. White women see themselves in Zendaya because her light skin, her fashion sensibility, and her cultural positioning as a mainstream aspirational figure do not trigger the categorical boundaries that would force an explicit acknowledgement of racial difference. Black women see themselves in Zendaya because she is unambiguously a black woman, the daughter of a black father, someone who has spoken publicly about her black identity, someone whose success is legible within the tradition of black female excellence. Biracial and multiracial women see themselves in Zendaya because she literally is what they are, a person who navigates multiple racial identities simultaneously, who exists in the liminal space between categories. And women of all backgrounds who are primarily oriented toward fashion, beauty, and celebrity culture see Zendaya through the lens of iconography rather than race, perceiving her as a style figure whose racial identity is secondary to her aesthetic identity. Each of these audience segments receives a different version of the same character. The product has not changed, the perception has. This is not an abstract theoretical point, it has direct, measurable economic consequences. Consider the specific dynamics of the wine tasting scene, the pivotal moment in the film where Emma confesses to having planned a school shooting. The scene unfolds through a game initiated by Mike and Rachel, a game where each person must confess the worst thing they have ever done. Mike confesses to using his girlfriend as a human shield against a dog in Mexico. Rachel confesses to locking a slow neighbor boy in a closet in an abandoned RV in the woods and leaving him there overnight. Charlie confesses to cyberbullying someone so badly that the victim's family moved away. And then Emma, pressed by the group's insistence, says quietly that she almost did a mass shooting. The room shifts. Rachel's response is immediate and visceral. She invokes her cousin Sam, who is in a wheelchair because of a shooting. She becomes hostile, aggressive, morally absolute. She says, "This is so disturbing," and storms toward leaving. Charlie tries to process. Mike tries to diffuse. Now here is where the racial architecture of the casting becomes a marketing engine. For a white audience watching this scene, Rachel's reaction reads as the normal human response to a horrifying revelation. Rachel is righteous. Rachel is protecting her family. Rachel is drawing a moral line. Emma crossed it. The drama is about whether Charlie can reconcile his love for Emma with the knowledge of who she once was. This is a compelling but relatively conventional narrative about forgiveness and moral complexity. But for a black or biracial audience watching the same scene through the lens of Zendaya's racial identity, Rachel's reaction reads entirely differently. It reads as a specific, historically recognizable form of white feminine violence, the deployment of moral purity as a weapon of racial exclusion. Rachel, a white woman, is not merely shocked by Emma's revelation. She is mobilizing her shock into a campaign of social punishment that includes withdrawing from the wedding, sabotaging Emma's professional relationships, telling other people about Emma's secret, and weaponizing her disabled cousin as a moral shield. This pattern, the white woman who positions herself as the victim of a black or biracial woman's perceived threat, who uses institutional and social power to punish and exclude, is a pattern that black women in America recognize instantly. It is the pattern of Amy Cooper in Central Park. It is the pattern of white women calling the police on black people for existing in spaces where they are perceived as threatening. It is the pattern that the term Karen was coined to describe. And it is a pattern that, when activated in the context of a film, generates enormous discursive energy because it connects a fictional narrative to a lived reality that millions of women experience. The transcript reveals this dynamic with surgical precision. When Rachel tells Emma, "You planned a school shooting," the line operates differently depending on the racial lens through which the viewer processes it. For a viewer who sees Emma as racially unmarked, as a universal every woman, the line is a statement of fact, a moral accusation that Emma must answer. For a viewer who sees Emma as a black or biracial woman, the line carries an additional charge, The charge of a white woman defining a black woman by her worst potential action, refusing to extend the grace of context, and using that definition as justification for social exile. The fact that Rachel's own confession, locking a mentally disabled child in a closet overnight, is treated by the group as a funny anecdote, while Emma's confession is treated as an existential threat, becomes, through the racial lens, evidence of a double standard that is not merely personal but structural. White women's violence is narrated as impulsive, accidental, forgivable. Black women's violence, even violence that was only ever planned and never executed, is narrated as essential, defining, permanent. This interpretive bifurcation is what makes racial ambiguity a go-to-market strategy. The film does not choose one reading over the other. It does not explicitly name the racial dimension. It does not have characters discuss race. It simply casts a racially ambiguous actress in a role that was written as white and allows the audience's own racial perception system to generate the interpretive framework. This means that the film can be marketed to and consumed by audiences with fundamentally different racial politics without alienating any of them. A conservative white viewer who does not think about race can watch the film as a straightforward moral drama. A progressive white viewer who is attuned to racial dynamics can watch it as a subtle critique of white feminism. A black viewer can watch it as a dramatization of racialized double standards. A biracial viewer can watch it as a meditation on how racial ambiguity navigates moral judgment. Each viewer gets a different film. Each viewer generates different discourse, and each discourse stream feeds the metastatic marketing architecture described in Section 1. Let us push this analysis further into the domain of feminist theory, because the intersection of race and gender in the drama is where the film's commercial architecture achieves its greatest sophistication. In feminist scholarship, there is a long-standing tension between what is sometimes called white feminism, a feminism that centers the experiences and concerns of white women while claiming universality, and intersectional feminism, which insists that race, class, sexuality, disability, and other axes of identity fundamentally shape women's experiences of gender. This tension has produced some of the most heated debates in contemporary feminist discourse, from the controversies surrounding the Women's March, to the debates about lean-in feminism, to the ongoing reckoning with how mainstream feminist organizations have historically excluded or marginalized women of color. The drama activates this tension directly through the Rachel-Emma dynamic. Rachel's response to Emma's confession is a case study in how white feminist moral frameworks can become instruments of racial exclusion. Rachel positions herself as the defender of victims, specifically her cousin Sam, a wheelchair-using mass shooting survivor. This positioning is structurally powerful because it allows Rachel to claim the moral high ground, not on her own behalf, but on behalf of a disabled person, which insulates her from criticism. To challenge Rachel's reaction is to appear to be minimizing the suffering of shooting victims. This is a rhetorical move that black feminist scholars would immediately recognize as a specific form of what Kimberly Crenshaw calls intersectional erasure, the use of one axis of marginalization, disability, victimhood, to obscure another axis of marginalization, race, and to justify the punishment of a person who exists at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities. The transcript makes this dynamic visible in a way that is both subtle and devastating. When Charlie tries to defend Emma by providing context, her friend died when she was young, she had no therapy, she was bullied, she was isolated. Rachel's response is dismissive. She says it is not interesting, it is awful. She refuses to engage with the contextualizing information that might complicate her moral judgment. And when Charlie points out that Rachel's own confession, locking a disabled child in a closet, involved actual harm to an actual person, while Emma's confession involved a plan that was never executed, Rachel draws a distinction that reveals the underlying logic of her position. She says it was an impulse, while Emma planned a cold-blooded murder. The word choice is revelatory. Rachel's violence was impulsive and therefore forgivable. Emma's violence was planned and therefore essential to her character. But this distinction maps directly onto racialized narratives about violence in America, where white violence is consistently narrated as exceptional, situational, and out of character, while black and brown violence is narrated as planned, inherent, and definitional. Rachel is not consciously making a racial argument. She does not say anything about race. But the structure of her argument reproduces a racial logic that has operated in American society for centuries. This is the genius of using Zendaya as the vessel for this dynamic. Because Zendaya is racially ambiguous, the racial reading of Rachel's behavior is available but not mandatory. A viewer can see the racial dimension or not see it, depending on their own racial literacy and the interpretive frameworks they bring to the film. This means the film can generate discourse across the full spectrum of racial awareness without ever being accused of being a race film. It is not about race. It is about a couple navigating a moral crisis before their wedding. But it is also, for those who can see it, profoundly about race, about how racial identity shapes who is forgiven and who is condemned, who is extended grace and who is defined by their worst moment, who is allowed to be complex and who is flattened into a category. The economic implications of this dual register strategy are significant. Films that are explicitly about race face a well-documented market limitation. They are categorized by distributors, exhibitors, and audiences as niche products with limited crossover appeal. The term urban audience has been used for decades as an industry euphemism for black audiences, and films targeted at urban audiences are typically given smaller marketing budgets, fewer screens, and lower box office expectations. By embedding racial commentary within a racially ambiguous framework, the drama avoids this categorical penalty entirely. It is marketed as a mainstream romantic drama starring two of the biggest young actors in Hollywood. It opens on 3,000 screens. It receives the full weight of A24’s marketing infrastructure. And yet, it contains, for those who can perceive it, a racial critique as sharp and as devastating as anything in an explicitly race-focused film. The racial commentary is smuggled past the market's categorical gatekeepers inside the Trojan horse of a wedding comedy. This Trojan horse strategy has implications that extend far beyond film marketing. It suggests a model for how marginalized perspectives can be introduced into mainstream cultural products without triggering the categorical resistance that typically limits their reach. The key is racial ambiguity as a design principle, the deliberate construction of cultural products that are legible through multiple racial frameworks simultaneously, allowing different audiences to extract different meanings from the same object. This is not colorblindness, which erases race entirely. It is something more sophisticated. Color fluidity, the strategic deployment of racial ambiguity to maximize market reach while preserving the capacity for racial critique. Let us now examine how this dynamic operates at the level of specific character interactions revealed in the transcript, because the granular details illuminate the macro-level architecture. Consider the scene where Emma tries to role-play a fresh encounter with Charlie to restart their sexual intimacy after the revelation has disrupted their relationship. Emma approaches Charlie in their own home, pretending they are meeting for the first time. She introduces herself. She asks his name. She flirts. Charlie cannot engage. The interaction collapses. This scene operates on multiple registers simultaneously. On the surface, it is a poignant depiction of how a relationship can be poisoned by knowledge, how learning something about your partner can make them simultaneously the person you love and a stranger you fear. But through the racial lens, the scene takes on an additional dimension. Emma is trying to perform innocence, to recreate the conditions under which Charlie first perceived her as non-threatening, desirable, and safe. She is trying to undo the damage that the revelation has done to Charlie's perception of her. And the inability to undo that damage, the way Charlie flinches when she appears unexpectedly, the way he asks whether she came upstairs to stab him, a question he frames as a joke, but that reveals a genuine recategorization of her from partner to potential threat, maps directly onto the experience of black and biracial people who are recategorized as dangerous once their racial identity becomes salient in a context where it was previously invisible or ambiguous. The scene where Charlie asks Emma about her childhood friend who died in a car accident is equally revealing. Charlie is trying to construct a psychological narrative that explains Emma's adolescent fascination with violence, trying to find the trauma that makes the revelation comprehensible. He asks about the dead neighbor. He asks about therapy. He suggests that witnessing death at a young age is a very vulnerable experience. Emma resists this line of inquiry. She says she knows what he is trying to say and does not think it is relevant. This resistance is fascinating because it operates differently depending on the racial lens. For a viewer who sees Emma as racially unmarked, her resistance reads as emotional avoidance, a reluctance to confront the psychological roots of her past. For a viewer who sees Emma through a racial lens, her resistance reads as a refusal to perform the trauma narrative that white institutional frameworks demand of black and brown people as a condition of forgiveness. In the American criminal justice system, in therapeutic settings, in media narratives about violence, black and brown individuals are consistently required to produce legible trauma narratives, stories of abuse, neglect, poverty, or environmental deprivation, to earn the sympathy that white individuals receive by default. Emma's refusal to narrate her trauma for Charlie's benefit can be read as a refusal to comply with this demand, a refusal to perform the explanatory labor that would make her legible within Charlie's framework. The film's treatment of young Emma, as narrated in the transcript through her own account of her adolescence, adds further layers to this analysis. She describes moving frequently as a child, settling when she was about 7, making friends, and then being uprooted again at 14 to Louisiana. She describes isolation, bullying, the feeling that everyone hated her. She describes becoming intrigued by the aesthetics of school shootings, believing a character she was playing and receiving attention because she was a girl engaging with what is typically understood as a male phenomenon. These details are presented without racial commentary, but they resonate differently depending on the viewer's racial framework. The experience of being the outsider, of not fitting in, of being bullied with comments like "ever heard of deodorant," these are experiences that have specific racial valences for a biracial or black girl in a predominantly white Southern school. The film never says this. It does not need to. Zendaya's presence says it. This brings us to a concept that we might call perceptual infrastructure. The idea that certain casting decisions create an interpretive infrastructure that operates independently of the screenplay, the direction, and the explicit content of the film. Zendaya's presence in the drama creates a perceptual infrastructure through which every scene, every interaction, every line of dialogue can be processed through a racial lens without the film ever activating that lens explicitly. This perceptual infrastructure is the go-to-market strategy. It is the mechanism through which a single product generates multiple value propositions for multiple audience segments simultaneously. And it is enabled specifically by racial ambiguity, by the fact that Zendaya occupies a position in the American racial imagination that is neither definitively black nor definitively not black, neither definitively other nor definitively same, but perpetually both, depending on who is looking. The philosophical implications of this are genuinely destabilizing. If the meaning of a cultural product is fundamentally determined by the racial perception system of the audience, then meaning is not a property of the product. It is a property of the interaction between the product and the perceiver. This is a radically constructivist theory of cultural meaning, one that locates the source of value not in the object, but in the interpretive act. And it suggests that the most commercially valuable cultural products are not those with the clearest or most powerful meanings, but those with the most productively ambiguous meanings, those that can be interpreted in the greatest number of ways by the greatest number of audiences without any interpretation being definitively wrong. The drama achieves this through the casting of Zendaya. The film's meaning is genuinely different depending on who is watching it, and each version of its meaning is equally valid, equally supported by the evidence of the film, and equally generative of discourse. This is not a flaw in the film's design. It is the design. We can connect this to the economic theory of platform markets, where the value of a platform increases with the number and diversity of participants. Facebook is valuable, not because all its users want the same thing, but because different users want different things, and the platform facilitates all of their desires simultaneously. The drama operates as a cultural platform in this sense, a single artifact that facilitates fundamentally different interpretive experiences for fundamentally different audiences, and whose value increases with the diversity of those experiences. Zendaya is the platform infrastructure. Her racial ambiguity is the protocol that allows different audiences to interface with the product in different ways. And the discourse generated by the collision of these different interpretations, when a black feminist's reading of Rachel's behavior encounters a white liberal's reading of the same behavior on the same social media timeline, is the network effect that drives the platform's growth. This framework also illuminates why Zendaya's position is economically irreplaceable in a way that has nothing to do with her acting ability. There are many actresses who could deliver a comparable performance in the role of Emma. There are very few who could deliver the same polymorphic market effect. The intersection of Zendaya's specific racial ambiguity, her cultural positioning as a fashion and beauty icon, her association with blockbuster franchises that give her name recognition across demographic boundaries, and her personal brand of aspirational multiculturalism creates a market asset that is genuinely unique. She is not interchangeable with another biracial actress, because the go-to-market strategy depends not just on racial ambiguity in the abstract, but on the specific configuration of racial ambiguity, cultural capital, and audience association that Zendaya uniquely embodies. Replacing her would not merely change the performance, it would collapse the entire multi-segment market architecture that her casting creates. Let us consider one final dimension of this analysis, the way Zendaya's casting transforms the film's relationship to the discourse around school shootings. In America, the dominant narrative of school shootings is overwhelmingly white and male. The archetypal school shooter in the American imagination is a young white man, isolated, angry, radicalized online, armed with legally purchased weapons. This archetype that is so deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness that Emma's revelation in the transcript carries an additional layer of transgression simply because she is female. As she tells Charlie, she received attention because she was a girl engaging with a phenomenon understood as male, but Zendaya's presence adds a racial transgression on top of the gender transgression. Not only is Emma a woman who planned a school shooting, a category violation against the gendered archetype, she is a biracial woman who planned a school shooting, which is a category violation against both the gendered and racial archetypes simultaneously. This compound category violation produces a compound discourse effect, generating conversations not only about gender and violence, but about race and violence, about who is allowed to be violent, about whose violence is legible within existing cultural narratives, and whose is not. The fact that the film never explicitly addresses this compound violation is precisely what makes it commercially effective. An explicit address would force the audience into a single interpretive framework, collapsing the polymorphic market effect. By leaving the racial dimension implicit, embedded in the casting rather than in the script, the film preserves the productive ambiguity that allows different audiences to generate different meanings. This is the ultimate sophistication of racial ambiguity as a go-to-market strategy. It creates the conditions for racial discourse without creating the conditions for racial backlash. The film cannot be accused of playing the race card because it never plays it. It simply places a racially ambiguous actress at the center of a morally charged narrative and allows the audience's own racial consciousness to do the rest. The market does the work, the discourse does the work, and the box office collects the revenue. This is the new frontier of identity-based market architecture, and it has implications that extend far beyond the film industry. Any product, any brand, any political campaign that can achieve productive racial ambiguity, that can be perceived as simultaneously speaking to and about multiple racial constituencies without explicitly addressing any of them, gains access to a market multiplier that no amount of traditional demographic targeting can replicate. The product becomes a mirror, and every audience sees its own reflection. Zendaya is the most sophisticated mirror in contemporary American culture, and the drama is the most sophisticated demonstration of what that mirror can accomplish when placed at the center of a narrative architecture designed to maximize discourse, division, and ultimately, revenue. The strategy is not cynical, it is not manipulative, it is structural, it is built into the architecture of American racial perception itself, and the firms and creators who understand how to leverage that architecture will continue to outperform those who do not. Racial ambiguity is not a marketing tactic. It is market infrastructure. And the drama is its proof of concept. There is one more observation worth making before we close this section, and it concerns the temporal dimension of racial ambiguity as market infrastructure. The value of Zendaya's polymorphic market effect does not diminish over time. It appreciates. As the cultural conversation around race in America continues to evolve, as new frameworks emerge, as old frameworks are contested, as the meaning of blackness, whiteness, and racial ambiguity continue to shift, the interpretive possibilities embedded in the drama's casting decision will continue to multiply. Future audiences will bring new racial literacies to the film, and those literacies will generate new readings, new discourse, and new cultural value. The film is not a fixed artifact. It is a living interpretive system, and Zendaya's racial ambiguity is the code that keeps it running. The market infrastructure does not decay. It compounds. There is a position that exists in the American cultural economy that has no formal name in organizational theory, no entry in the marketing lexicon, and no established framework in the sociology of celebrity. Yet, it is one of the most powerful, most coveted, and most structurally dangerous positions that a human being can occupy. We are going to name it here. We are going to call it the institutional cultural position, and we are going to demonstrate that it operates with a logic that is fundamentally different from fame, celebrity, stardom, or any of the other categories through which we typically understand prominence in the entertainment industry. The institutional cultural position is not about being famous, it is about being necessary. It is about occupying a structural role in the cultural economy that the economy itself cannot function without, a role that exists independently of the individual who fills it, that predates them, and that will outlast them. And it is about the specific, devastating trap that this position creates for the individual who occupies it, the trap of being unable to be human without risking everything. Zendaya occupies an institutional cultural position. To understand what this means and why it matters for our analysis of the drama, we must first distinguish the institutional cultural position from ordinary celebrity. A celebrity is a person who is widely known. A star is a celebrity whose fame is tied to a specific domain of performance, acting, music, athletics. An icon is a star whose image has transcended their domain of performance to become a symbol of something larger: beauty, rebellion, elegance, power. But an institutional cultural position is something beyond all of these. It is a position within the cultural infrastructure of a society that serves a specific structural function, and the person who occupies it is valued not for who they are, but for the function they perform. The function that Zendaya performs is this. She is the aspirational embodiment of successful multiculturalism within the mainstream American media ecosystem. She is the living proof that the system works, that a biracial woman can ascend to the highest levels of fashion, film, and cultural influence without being reduced to a racial category, without being confined to a niche market, and without sacrificing the mainstream acceptability that is the precondition for institutional power. This is not a role that Zendaya chose in the way that an actress chooses a part. It is a role that the cultural economy assigned to her because she fits its structural requirements, and it is a role that she maintains because the consequences of vacating it are existential. To understand the institutional cultural position, we must understand the economic logic that creates it. In any complex economy, there are positions that are structurally necessary, positions that must be filled for the system to function. In a corporation, the CEO position is structurally necessary. The individual who occupies it can be replaced, but the position itself cannot be eliminated without fundamentally restructuring the organization. In a political system, the head of state position is structurally necessary. Presidents and prime ministers come and go, but the position persists because the system requires someone to perform the functions associated with it. The institutional cultural position operates on the same logic. The American media ecosystem requires, at any given moment, a small number of figures who embody specific cultural values and aspirations. It requires a figure of multicultural aspiration, someone who represents the possibility of transcending racial boundaries while remaining commercially viable across all demographic segments. It requires a figure of feminine power, someone who embodies the contemporary ideal of female strength, independence, and self-possession. It requires a figure of aesthetic excellence, someone whose visual presentation sets the standard for beauty, fashion, and style. Zendaya occupies all three of these functional positions simultaneously, which is what makes her institutional cultural position so powerful and so precarious. The precariousness is the critical point. An institutional cultural position is powerful because it confers enormous cultural, social, and economic capital on its occupant. Zendaya's position gives her access to the most prestigious fashion houses, the most high-profile film roles, the most lucrative brand partnerships, and the most influential media platforms. It gives her a form of cultural authority that extends far beyond her specific achievements as a performer. When Zendaya walks a red carpet, the event becomes about her. When Zendaya wears a designer's creation, the designer's brand is elevated. When Zendaya appears in a film, the film acquires a cultural significance that is independent of its artistic merit. This is institutional power, power that flows from the position rather than from the individual. But institutional power comes with institutional constraints, and this is where the trap closes. The institutional cultural position is maintained through a set of unwritten but rigorously enforced behavioral requirements that function as what we might call a brand covenant, an implicit agreement between the position holder and the cultural economy that grants them their power. The brand covenant requires, above all, the maintenance of a specific image. For Zendaya, this image is one of aspirational perfection: beauty, grace, intelligence, poise, political correctness, and an almost preternatural ability to navigate the complexities of race, gender, and celebrity without ever making a misstep. The brand covenant does not permit bad days. It does not permit public failures. It does not permit the expression of genuine vulnerability, confusion, anger, pettiness, or any of the other emotions and behaviors that constitute the full range of human experience. It certainly does not permit the kind of moral complexity that Emma Harwood embodies in the drama, the complexity of a person who was once capable of planning a school shooting and who now lives as a kind, empathetic, loving partner. This is what makes the institutional cultural position a trap. The position grants enormous power, but it demands, in exchange, the surrender of authentic selfhood. The person who occupies the position must perform a version of themselves that is optimized for institutional function rather than human truth. Every public appearance, every social media post, every interview, every fashion choice, every romantic relationship must be filtered through what we might call the institutional risk calculus, a continuous, often unconscious assessment of whether a given action or expression will strengthen, weaken, or threaten the position. This risk calculus operates like an underwriting system in the insurance industry. In insurance, underwriting is the process of evaluating risk to determine whether to issue a policy and at what premium. The institutional risk calculus performs the same function for the cultural position. It evaluates every potential action against the risk of position loss and determines whether the action should be taken, modified, or suppressed. Consider the specific constraints this imposes on Zendaya. She cannot express genuine political opinions that are controversial enough to alienate any significant portion of her audience, because her position depends on cross-demographic appeal. She cannot be photographed looking disheveled, exhausted, or unglamorous, because her position depends on aesthetic perfection. She cannot date someone whose public persona introduces reputational risk, because her position depends on the maintenance of an aspirational romantic narrative. She cannot have public conflicts with other celebrities, because her position depends on the perception of universal likability. She cannot express doubt about her own talent, uncertainty about her career choices, or dissatisfaction with the industry that employs her, because her position depends on the projection of confident, graceful self-possession. She cannot, in short, be fully human in public. She can only be the institutional version of herself, the version that serves the function the cultural economy requires her to perform. This is where Tom Holland becomes relevant to our analysis, and his relevance illuminates the institutional logic with extraordinary clarity. Tom Holland is Zendaya's romantic partner, and he is, from the perspective of institutional risk management, the ideal choice. Holland is the product of the Brit School, the same institution that produced Adele, Amy Winehouse, and other British performers who are trained in the art of professional presentation. He's unfailingly polite, self-deprecating, charming, and non-threatening. He does not have public controversies. He does not express polarizing political opinions. He does not engage in the kind of erratic public behavior that would generate negative attention. He is, in the language of insurance, a low-risk counterparty. If the institutional cultural position were a building, Tom Holland would be the insurance policy written by Lloyd's of London to protect it. He is the actuarial ideal, a partner whose public persona introduces virtually zero risk to the position holder's brand architecture. This is not a criticism of Holland or of the relationship. It is a structural observation about how the institutional cultural position shapes the choices available to its occupant. The position does not merely constrain professional behavior, it constrains intimate behavior. It reaches into the most private dimensions of a person's life and subjects them to the institutional risk calculus. The person who occupies the position does not choose a partner the way other people choose partners, through the messy, irrational, often self-destructive process of falling in love. They choose a partner, or they are constrained to choose a partner, who is compatible with the position's requirements. The relationship itself becomes a brand asset, and the partner becomes what organizational theorists would call a complementary asset, an asset whose value is derived not from its intrinsic properties, but from its compatibility with another, more central asset. Let us now push this analysis into the domain of political philosophy, because the institutional cultural position has implications that connect directly to some of the most fundamental questions about freedom, power, and selfhood. In liberal political theory, freedom is understood as the absence of external constraint, the ability to act according to one's own will without interference from others. The institutional cultural position creates a form of constraint that does not fit neatly into this framework because it is not imposed by any external authority. There is no CEO of Zendaya's career who issues directives about what she can and cannot do. There is no contract that specifies the behavioral requirements of the position. The constraint is structural. It emerges from the logic of the position itself, from the implicit understanding that certain behaviors will be rewarded with continued access to institutional power, and certain behaviors will be punished with position loss. This is what Michel Foucault would call a disciplinary mechanism, a form of power that operates not through explicit prohibition, but through the internalization of norms, the self-regulation of behavior, and the continuous monitoring of one's own conduct against an ideal standard. The person who occupies the institutional cultural position becomes their own prison guard. They do not need to be told what they cannot do. They know. The knowledge is embedded in the position itself, and the position is embedded in them. This Foucauldian analysis connects to a concept in feminist theory known as the performance of femininity. The idea, developed by Judith Butler and others, that gender is not a natural property of bodies, but a set of behaviors that are continuously performed in accordance with social expectations. The institutional cultural position requires a specific performance of femininity that is even more constrained than the performance required of women in general. It requires the performance of ideal femininity, femininity that is aspirational, flawless, graceful, politically correct, aesthetically perfect, and emotionally controlled. This performance must be sustained 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, across every platform and in every context. There is no backstage. There is no moment when the performer can remove the mask and reveal the human beneath. The mask is the position, and the position is everything. This is precisely what makes the drama so significant as a text within the context of Zendaya's career, and this is the connection that bridges the institutional cultural position trap to the broader case study. In the film, Zendaya plays a character who has done the thing that the institutional cultural position absolutely cannot permit. She has been dangerous. She has been violent. Not in the sanitized, aestheticized way that action films depict violence, where the protagonist kills dozens of anonymous enemies and the audience cheers, but in the specific, morally complex, socially terrifying way of a teenager who planned to murder her classmates. This is the institutional cultural position's worst nightmare. It is the kind of revelation that, if it were attached to Zendaya herself, rather than to a character she plays, would be position-destroying. It would shatter the brand covenant. It would collapse the aspirational image. It would end the institutional function she performs. But the film provides what the institutional cultural position does not, a license to be human. By placing this moral complexity in a fictional character, the film allows Zendaya to access dimensions of human experience that her institutional position forbids her from accessing in her own life. Emma Harwood can be dangerous. Emma Harwood can be morally compromised. Emma Harwood can be the subject of suspicion, fear, and social punishment. Emma Harwood can flinch when her partner asks if she came upstairs to stab him. Emma Harwood can lose control, snapping at a driver in a crosswalk, engaging in a physical altercation that involves slapping. Emma Harwood can be fragile, wounded, uncertain, and afraid. Zendaya cannot be any of these things in public, but she can play them. The screen becomes what we might call a licensed vulnerability space, a zone in which the occupant of an institutional cultural position can express the full range of human experience without triggering the institutional risk calculus that would otherwise suppress it. This licensed vulnerability space is not unique to Zendaya. It is a structural feature of the institutional cultural position itself. Throughout the history of the entertainment industry, figures who have occupied positions of aspirational perfection have used film and other performance contexts as the only available venue for expressing their own complexity. Audrey Hepburn, whose institutional cultural position required the performance of delicate, graceful femininity, played characters who were emotionally turbulent, morally ambiguous, and occasionally ruthless. Grace Kelly, whose position required the performance of aristocratic poise, played characters who were sexually aggressive, manipulative, and calculating. The pattern is consistent. The performance space that provides access to dimensions of selfhood that the institutional position suppresses. But Zendaya's relationship to the licensed vulnerability space is distinctive in a way that reflects the specific conditions of 21st century celebrity. In the era of social media, the boundary between the institutional self and the authentic self has become thinner and more permeable than ever before. Audiences in the digital age demand authenticity. They want to feel that they know the real person behind the public image. This creates an impossible double bind for the occupant of an institutional cultural position. The position requires the suppression of authentic selfhood. The audience demands its expression. The licensed vulnerability space of film resolves this contradiction by providing a venue in which audiences can experience a version of the performer's authentic selfhood, their capacity for darkness, complexity, and moral ambiguity, while maintaining the fiction that what they are seeing is a character, not the person. The audience gets to feel that they have seen something real. The performer gets to express something real. And the institutional cultural position remains intact because the expression occurred within the protective frame of fiction. The transcript of the drama reveals how precisely the film is calibrated to exploit this dynamic. Consider the scene where Emma tells Charlie about her adolescence. She describes moving frequently as a child, finding stability at 7, being uprooted at 14, moving to Louisiana, failing to make friends, being bullied, and becoming intrigued by the aesthetics of school shootings. She says she started to believe a character she was playing. This last detail is metatextually fascinating because it describes within the fiction exactly the process that Zendaya herself undergoes as an occupant of the institutional cultural position. Zendaya, too, plays a character, the character of the aspirational multicultural icon, and the question of whether she has come to believe that character, whether it has merged with her authentic selfhood or replaced it entirely, is one of the most psychologically interesting questions that the institutional cultural position raises. The scene where Emma tries to restart her relationship with Charlie through roleplay, pretending to meet him for the first time, is equally revealing in this context. Emma is performing a version of herself that predates the revelation, a version that is clean, unburdened, and uncomplicated by the knowledge of what she once was. She is trying to recreate the institutional self, the self that Charlie fell in love with, by performing it. But the performance fails because Charlie can no longer unsee what he has seen. He cannot return to the version of Emma that existed before the revelation. The institutional self has been compromised, and no amount of performance can restore it. This is the institutional cultural position's deepest fear made manifest in fiction, the fear that the authentic self will leak through the institutional performance and destroy everything. Let us formalize the economics of the institutional cultural position. The position can be modeled as a form of monopolistic rent, economic value that accrues to the position holder not because of superior productivity or skill, but because of scarcity. There are very few people who can occupy the position of aspirational multicultural icon in the American media ecosystem at any given time. The position requires a specific combination of racial ambiguity, physical beauty, conforming to both European and African aesthetic standards simultaneously, professional competence across multiple domains, absence of scandal, and a public persona that projects warmth, intelligence, and accessibility. The number of people who satisfy all of these requirements simultaneously is extremely small, which means the position holder earns monopolistic rents, returns that are disproportionate to their intrinsic capabilities, and that reflect instead the scarcity of the position itself. But monopolistic rents are fragile. They persist only as long as the monopoly persists, and monopolies are vulnerable to disruption. In the case of the institutional cultural position, the primary threat is not competition from outside, but collapse from within. The possibility that the position holder will do something that violates the brand covenant and triggers a rapid, cascading loss of institutional support. This is why the institutional risk calculus is so vigilant and so conservative. A single misstep, a single photograph, a single tweet, a single public incident that contradicts the aspirational image can trigger what economists call a bank run on the position. Once the market begins to doubt the position holder's ability to maintain the image, the doubt becomes self-fulfilling. Brand partners withdraw. Media coverage shifts from reverential to skeptical. Audiences begin to look for a replacement, and the replacement, crucially, is always available. The position exists independently of the person who fills it, and there is always someone waiting to fill it. The historical evidence for this pattern is abundant. Halle Berry occupied a version of the institutional cultural position in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Her position eroded not through any single catastrophic event, but through an accumulation of choices: film roles that did not perform commercially, public relationships that introduced reputational complexity, and a gradual loss of the fashion-forward cultural positioning that had sustained her institutional relevance. The position did not disappear when Berry left it. It simply waited for the next occupant. And when Zendaya arrived, younger, more digitally native, more racially ambiguous, more perfectly calibrated to the aesthetic and political requirements of the contemporary moment, the position accepted her as if it had been designed for her, which, in a structural sense, it had. This succession pattern reveals something profound about the nature of the institutional cultural position. The person is fungible, but the position is not. The position is a permanent feature of the cultural economy, a structural role that the system requires and that it will always fill. The individual who occupies it is, from the system's perspective, interchangeable, a temporary vessel for a permanent function. This has implications for how we understand the power dynamics of celebrity. The person who occupies the institutional cultural position appears, from the outside, to be at the pinnacle of cultural power. They are on every magazine cover, at every prestigious event, in every major film, but the power they wield is not their own. It is the position's power, and it flows through them only as long as they maintain the behavioral requirements that the position demands. The moment they fail to maintain those requirements, the power transfers to someone else. The person who seemed to have everything is revealed to have had nothing that was truly theirs. The power was always on loan. This analysis connects to what Karl Marx called alienation, the separation of the worker from the product of their labor. In Marx's formulation, the factory worker is alienated because the products they create are owned by the capitalist, not by the worker. The occupant of the institutional cultural position experiences a different but structurally analogous form of alienation, the separation of the self from the image. The image, the aspirational, perfect, institutionally compliant version of the self, is the product that generates value. But the image is not owned by the person. It is owned by the system, by the network of brand partners, media outlets, studios, fashion houses, and audience expectations that collectively constitute the institutional cultural position. The person is the worker who produces the image, but the image belongs to the institution. And when the institution decides that the person can no longer produce the required image, the institution simply finds a new worker. This is the ultimate cruelty of the institutional cultural position. It offers the person everything that our culture teaches us to desire: fame, beauty, wealth, influence, admiration. And in exchange, it takes the one thing that cannot be replaced: the freedom to be fully, authentically, imperfectly human. Zendaya cannot have a bad day in public. She cannot post an unflattering photograph. She cannot express an unpopular opinion. She cannot date someone who introduces risk. She cannot grieve publicly in a way that is ugly or undignified. She cannot rage. She cannot fail. She cannot be ordinary. And the impossibility of being ordinary is, when you really examine it, one of the most extraordinary forms of suffering that the modern cultural economy produces. The drama gives Zendaya 48 hours of licensed humanity. For the duration of the film, she is allowed to be Emma Harwood, a woman who is dangerous, flawed, morally compromised, and terrifyingly real. She's allowed to vomit at her own wedding rehearsal. She's allowed to snap at a stranger in a crosswalk. She's allowed to carry a secret that, if revealed, would destroy her life. She is allowed to be the person that the institutional cultural position will never permit Zendaya herself to be. And then the credits roll, and she returns to the position, and the position resumes its requirements, and the performance continues. The screen goes dark, the mask goes back on, and the gilded prison closes its gates, beautiful and inescapable, until the next film offers another 48 hours of freedom. This is not a metaphor. This is the structural reality of the institutional cultural position, and the drama is the most transparent dramatization of it that the contemporary entertainment industry has produced. The film is not only about a woman whose past threatens to destroy her present. It is about the institutional cultural position itself, about the unbearable weight of being required to be perfect, about the impossibility of containing the full range of human experience within a brand architecture, and about the specific, devastating way that the cultural economy punishes those who fail to maintain the performance. Rachel's reaction to Emma's revelation is not merely the reaction of a friend who is horrified by a secret. It is the reaction of the market when the brand covenant is violated. It is the withdrawal of support, the cascade of consequences, the mobilization of moral authority in the service of institutional discipline. Rachel is not a villain. She is a function, the function of enforcing the brand covenant that the institutional cultural position depends on for its survival. And Zendaya, standing at the center of all of this, delivers the performance through the only register that the institutional cultural position permits: restraint. She cannot be explosive because explosion would violate the brand covenant even within the fiction. She cannot be ugly because ugliness would violate the aesthetic requirements of the position. She can only be what the position allows her to be: quiet, watchful, wounded, contained, and hope that the audience reads the restraint not as limitation, but as depth, and the category context. Perception engine, described in Section 2, ensures that they do, because the audience is not evaluating an actress delivering a restrained performance. They are evaluating an icon who is daring to be human. And the gap between those two frames is where the perception of transcendence lives. There is a mathematical dimension to the institutional cultural position trap that deserves formal articulation before we close this section. The position can be modeled as a constrained optimization problem. Let U represent the utility, the satisfaction, fulfillment, and authentic self-expression that the position holder derives from their life. Let I represent the institutional compliance cost, the degree to which the position holder must suppress authentic desires, opinions, behaviors, and relationships to maintain the position. Let R represent the institutional rent, the economic and social returns the position generates, and let P represent the probability of position loss in any given period, which is a function of the position holder's compliance with the brand covenant. The position holder's optimization problem is to maximize U subject to the constraint that P remains below some threshold, the threshold at which the risk of losing the position becomes unacceptable. The problem is that U and I are inversely related. Greater institutional compliance, more rigorous suppression of authenticity, reduces U while also reducing P. The position holder must sacrifice personal utility to maintain institutional security. And because R is so large, because the economic and social returns of the position are so enormous, the position holder has a powerful incentive to accept very high levels of I, which means very low levels of U. They will sacrifice almost everything to keep the position, because the position is worth almost everything. This is the mathematical structure of the gilded prison. The returns are so high that the rational actor will endure almost any degree of self-suppression to maintain them. But the model breaks down at a critical threshold. There is a point at which I become so large, the compliance cost so crushing, that the position holder can no longer sustain the performance. This is the point of institutional burnout, and it typically manifests as one of two outcomes: a public breakdown that triggers the cascade of position loss described above, or a strategic withdrawal from public life that preserves the position's mystique while allowing the person to recover. The historical record is filled with both outcomes. Some occupants of institutional cultural positions have experienced spectacular public collapses, moments when the authentic self erupted through the institutional performance with destructive force. Others have managed more graceful exits, withdrawing into privacy before the contradiction between self and image became unsustainable. But in either case, the pattern confirms the structural analysis. The institutional cultural position is inherently unstable because it requires the suppression of human complexity, and human complexity, like water, will always find a way through. The only question is whether it comes through the controlled aperture of a licensed vulnerability space, a film, a performance, a carefully managed public confession, or whether it comes through the uncontrolled rupture of a breakdown. The drama offers Zendaya the controlled aperture. And the controlled aperture, in the economy of the institutional cultural position, is there's a dimension of celebrity romance that has never been properly theorized, and its absence from the academic literature represents a genuine blind spot in our understanding of how the cultural economy operates. The dimension is this: romantic partnerships between occupants of institutional cultural positions are not merely personal relationships. They are financial instruments. They are risk management devices. They are, in the most precise and technical sense of the term, insurance policies, contractual arrangements, whether explicit or implicit, designed to protect the value of an asset against the possibility of loss. The asset, in this case, is the institutional cultural position described in Section 4. The insurance policy is the romantic partner. And the underwriting process, the evaluation of risk, the assessment of coverage, the calculation of premiums, is the institutional risk calculus that governs every dimension of the position holder's public life. We are going to call this framework the insurance policy theory of celebrity romance, and we are going to demonstrate that it explains, with a precision that no existing celebrity studies framework can match, the structural logic of Tom Holland's relationship with Zendaya and its function within the broader marketing architecture of the drama. Let us begin with the fundamentals of insurance as an economic institution, because the analogy is not casual, it is structural. In the insurance industry, an insurance policy is a contract between two parties: the insured, who faces a risk of loss, and the insurer, who agrees to compensate the insured in the event of loss in exchange for a premium. The purpose of insurance is not to eliminate risk cannot be eliminated, but to transfer the financial consequences of risk from the insured to the insurer, thereby protecting the insured's economic position against adverse events. The underwriting process is the mechanism through which the insurer evaluates the risk associated with a particular policy. Underwriters assess the probability of loss, the potential magnitude of loss, and the characteristics of the insured that affect both. Based on this assessment, they determine whether to issue the policy, at what premium, and with what exclusions. Now apply this framework to the institutional cultural position. The position holder, Zendaya, faces a continuous risk of position loss. As we established in Section 4, the position is maintained through compliance with a brand covenant that requires aspirational perfection across every dimension of public life. Any deviation from this covenant, a scandal, a controversy, a public misstep, can trigger a cascading loss of institutional support that destroys the position. The romantic partner functions as an insurance policy against this risk. A partner who is stable, non-controversial, institutionally aligned, and reputationally clean reduces the probability of position loss by eliminating one of the most significant sources of reputational risk, the partner themselves. Conversely, a partner who is volatile, controversial, scandal-prone, or reputationally complex increases the probability of position loss by introducing additional risk vectors that the position holder cannot control. Tom Holland is, from the perspective of this framework, the actuarial ideal. He is the partner who minimizes the expected loss function of the institutional cultural position. To understand why, we must examine his specific characteristics through the lens of insurance underwriting. First, his training. Holland is a product of the Brit School for Performing Arts and Technology in Croydon, South London. The Brit School is, functionally, an institution that produces performers who are optimized for institutional compliance. Its graduates, Adele, Amy Winehouse, Jessie J, Katie Malua, Tom Holland, are trained not only in performance skills, but in the art of professional presentation, media management, and public conduct. The Brit School does not produce rebels, it produces professionals. Its pedagogical model is designed to take raw talent and shape it into a form that is compatible with the requirements of the entertainment industry, an industry that demands reliability, predictability, and the ability to sustain a public persona over decades. Holland's Brit School training is, in insurance terms, the equivalent of a building that has been constructed to code. It reduces the probability of structural failure. It is a risk factor that underwriters evaluate favorably. Second, his public persona. Holland has cultivated, or more accurately, has been cultivated to embody, a public persona that is almost comically non-threatening. He is self-deprecating in interviews. He acknowledges his own awkwardness with a charming lack of pretension. He tells stories about accidentally spoiling Marvel plot points, and these stories function as a form of strategic vulnerability. They make him seem human and relatable without introducing any genuine reputational risk. Spoiling a movie is not a scandal. It is a brand-compatible form of imperfection that actually strengthens his public persona by making the institutional compliance seem effortless rather than performed. In insurance terms, Holland's public persona is the equivalent of a comprehensive fire suppression system. It does not merely reduce the probability of damage, it actively contains potential damage before it can spread. Third, his romantic history. Prior to Zendaya, Holland's public romantic history is essentially non-existent. There are no high-profile ex-partners, no messy breakups, no tabloid feuds, no custody disputes, no allegations, no incidents. His romantic history is, from an underwriting perspective, a clean loss record, the equivalent of a driver with no accidents, no tickets, and no claims. This clean record reduces the premium that the institutional cultural position must pay to maintain the insurance policy. It means that the partnership introduces virtually zero incremental risk to the position. Fourth, his cultural positioning. Holland is British, which introduces a specific set of cultural associations that are beneficial to the insurance function. Britishness, in the American cultural imagination, is associated with politeness, restraint, education, civility, and a kind of harmless eccentricity that is perceived as charming rather than threatening. These associations are not neutral, they are risk-reducing. An American partner might carry associations with specific American cultural and political tensions, associations with particular racial, regional, or class identities that could introduce friction with certain audience segments. A British partner, by contrast, carries associations that are almost universally positive in the American market. Holland's Britishness functions as a form of cultural hedging. It diversifies the risk profile of the partnership by introducing an identity element that is legible as prestigious and non-threatening across virtually all American demographic segments. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, his Spider-Man identity. Holland is not merely Tom Holland. He is Spider-Man. This is an identity that carries extraordinary institutional weight. Spider-Man is, arguably, the most universally beloved character in the Marvel Universe, a character associated with innocence, responsibility, self-sacrifice, and the transition from adolescence to adulthood. Holland's identification with this character is not incidental to his insurance function, it is central to it. By dating Spider-Man, Zendaya is associating her institutional cultural position with the single most risk-averse character in contemporary popular culture. Spider-Man does not drink excessively, does not use drugs, does not engage in sexual misconduct, does not express radical political opinions, does not do anything that would compromise his status as a role model for children. Spider-Man is institutional compliance incarnate. And Holland, by embodying Spider-Man across multiple films and cultural contexts, has absorbed this institutional compliance into his own public persona to such a degree that it is nearly impossible to separate the actor from the character. We can formalize this analysis using the language of actuarial science. Let L represent the expected loss associated with the institutional cultural position, the probability-weighted cost of position loss. Let R represent the set of risk factors that contribute to L. Among these risk factors, the romantic partner is one of the most significant because romantic relationships are inherently volatile, emotionally intense, and capable of generating the kind of uncontrolled public incidents that trigger cascading position loss. Let P partner represent the risk contribution of the romantic partner. Then P Holland, the risk contribution of Tom Holland as a partner, is approximately as close to zero as it is possible for a romantic partner to achieve. His Brit school training, his clean romantic history, his non-controversial public persona, his British cultural associations, and his Spider-Man identity all function as risk-reducing factors that drive P. Holland towards zero. The result is that Zendaya's overall expected loss, L, is minimized, which means her institutional cultural position is maximally protected. Now let us consider what this framework reveals about the relationship itself. The insurance policy theory does not claim that the relationship between Zendaya and Holland is not genuine, or that it is purely strategic. It claims something more subtle and more interesting, that the institutional logic of the institutional cultural position creates a selection pressure that shapes which relationships are possible and which are not. Just as natural selection does not design organisms, but creates conditions under which certain traits are more likely to survive and reproduce, the institutional selection pressure does not choose Zendaya's partners, but creates conditions under which certain types of partners are more likely to emerge and persist. A partner who introduces high reputational risk would face enormous institutional headwinds, media scrutiny, brand partner anxiety, audience backlash, that would strain the relationship and increase the probability of its dissolution. A partner who introduces low reputational risk faces institutional tailwinds, media approval, brand partner comfort, audience enthusiasm, that reinforce the relationship and increase its stability. Holland faces tailwinds. The institutional logic supports the relationship. This does not mean the relationship is caused by institutional logic. It means the relationship is enabled by it, sustained by it, and shaped by it in ways that the participants may or may not be fully conscious of. This connects to a concept in evolutionary biology known as sexual selection, the process by which certain traits become prevalent in a population, not because they increase survival, but because they increase mating success. In sexual selection theory, individuals choose mates based on traits that signal fitness, traits like physical symmetry, colorful plumage, or elaborate courtship displays. The insurance policy theory suggests an analogous process operating in the celebrity economy, institutional selection, in which the traits that determine romantic partnership are not biological fitness signals, but institutional fitness signals: stability, non-controversy, risk aversion, brand compatibility. Holland's traits are institutional fitness signals. They signal to the cultural economy that he is a safe, compatible, risk-reducing partner for an occupant of the institutional cultural position. And the cultural economy rewards these signals with approval, support, and reinforcement. Let us now examine how the insurance policy theory operates specifically within the drama, because the film creates a fascinating tension between the insurance function of the real-world partnership and the narrative dynamics of the fictional one. In the film, Robert Pattinson plays Charlie Thompson, Emma's fiancé. Charlie is, in many ways, the anti-Holland, a character who embodies institutional fragility rather than institutional stability. Charlie is anxious, insecure, emotionally volatile, and incapable of maintaining composure under pressure. He lies about having read a book to impress Emma. He cannot write a wedding speech without spiraling into self-doubt. He asks his colleague Misha what she would do if her boyfriend had planned a school shooting, and then, in a moment of emotional collapse, kisses her. He vomits at his own wedding. He delivers a speech that disintegrates into a public confession of his own inadequacy. He is, in insurance terms, a catastrophic risk, a partner who not only fails to protect the position but actively undermines it. This contrast between Holland, the real-world insurance policy, and Charlie, the fictional catastrophic risk, is not accidental. It is a structural feature of the film's design that serves the broader marketing architecture. By casting Pattinson, whose own public persona is defined by a kind of aristocratic self-destruction, a willingness to heap objection on his own handsome head, as one review put it, the film creates a fictional romantic partnership that is the exact inverse of Zendaya's real-world romantic partnership. In the real world, Zendaya is with the safest possible partner. In the film, she is with the most dangerous. This contrast generates a specific form of audience engagement. The audience watches Emma navigate a relationship with a partner who is falling apart, and they cannot help but compare this fictional dynamic with the real-world dynamic they know from tabloids, social media, and press coverage. The comparison reinforces the value of the real-world partnership by dramatizing its opposite. It shows, through negative example, what happens when the insurance policy fails, when the partner cannot contain his own anxiety, cannot maintain the performance of stability, and ultimately collapses in a way that threatens everything. The transcript reveals this dynamic with extraordinary precision. Consider Charlie's behavior after Emma's revelation. He tries to maintain composure. He tells Emma he loves her. He says he does not care about her past, but his body betrays him. He cannot perform sexually. He flinches when she appears unexpectedly. He throws away a coffee mug that has the slogan, "Coffee or I'll shoot," because its casual reference to shooting has become unbearable. He lies about throwing it away. He picks fights. He cannot sleep. He goes to Misha and, under the pretext of asking a hypothetical question, reveals Emma's secret. And then he kisses Misha, a breach of the romantic covenant that mirrors, at the personal level, the kind of breach that the insurance policy theory is designed to prevent at the institutional level. Charlie's trajectory in the film is a case study in what happens when the insurance policy is not merely absent but inverted, when the partner becomes the primary source of risk rather than the primary defense against it. Every action Charlie takes after the revelation introduces additional risk to Emma's social position. His inability to keep the secret means that the information spreads, from Charlie to Misha, from Rachel to whoever Rachel tells, until by the wedding day, Emma is surrounded by people who know her worst secret and are whispering about it. His emotional instability makes him unpredictable, which means Emma cannot manage the situation through the careful, controlled responses that the institutional risk calculus would demand. His public collapse at the wedding, the incoherent speech, the confession about Misha, the shouting, transforms what should have been a private crisis into a public spectacle. In insurance terms, Charlie is an uninsurable risk. No underwriter would issue a policy on a position that was exposed to this level of partner-generated volatility. And yet, and this is where the analysis becomes genuinely interesting, the film ends with reconciliation. Charlie and Emma find each other after the wedding disaster. They sit together on a bench. Charlie is battered and bruised from being punched by Blake. Emma asks what happened to his face. He lies, claiming he saved a woman's baby from a man who was going to eat it. She laughs. They are performing the meet cute again, but this time with full knowledge of each other's worst qualities. This ending can be read through the insurance policy theory as a radical proposition, the proposition that the most valuable insurance against position loss is not a risk-free partner, but a partner who has seen the full range of your humanity, including the parts that the institutional cultural position suppresses, and chosen to stay anyway. This is insurance, not through risk elimination, but through risk acceptance. It is a fundamentally different model, and it challenges the entire logic of the institutional risk calculus. The philosophical implications of this alternative model are profound. The institutional risk calculus assumes that risk is the enemy, that the goal of the position holder is to minimize exposure to anything that could threaten the position. But the film's ending suggests that this assumption is itself a form of risk, because a life organized around risk minimization is a life that cannot contain the full range of human experience. The position holder who suppresses their authentic self to maintain the position is not eliminating risk. They are transforming it, converting external risk, the risk of position loss, into internal risk, the risk of psychological disintegration, burnout, alienation from self. The insurance policy that protects the position may simultaneously damage the person, and the partner who is selected for institutional fitness may be precisely the wrong partner for human fitness, for the deep, sustaining, imperfect intimacy that human beings need to survive. This is the paradox at the heart of the insurance policy theory. The logic that makes Tom Holland the perfect partner for Zendaya's institutional cultural position may be the same logic that makes him insufficient for Zendaya's human needs. We do not know this, of course. We cannot see behind the institutional performance, but the structural analysis suggests the possibility, and the drama dramatizes it through the character of Charlie, who is institutionally catastrophic but humanly present, who falls apart, who fails, who betrays, but who also sees Emma completely, knows her worst secret, and chooses her anyway. The film asks, implicitly, which kind of insurance is more valuable, the kind that protects the position or the kind that protects the person? Let us extend this analysis into the domain of financial economics, because the insurance policy theory has implications that connect to portfolio theory and the management of financial risk. In Harry Markowitz's modern portfolio theory, the optimal investment strategy is not to minimize risk, but to optimize the risk-return trade-off, to accept the level of risk that maximizes expected return for a given level of risk tolerance. The institutional cultural position, as we have described it, is managed like a conservative portfolio, one that prioritizes capital preservation over growth, that selects low-risk assets, like Holland, over high-return but high-risk assets, and that sacrifices potential upside to protect against downside. But the film suggests an alternative portfolio strategy, one that accepts higher risk in exchange for higher returns, where the returns are measured not in economic terms but in human terms, in intimacy, authenticity, vulnerability, and the capacity for genuine connection. Charlie is the high-risk, high-return asset. He introduces enormous volatility into Emma's life. He cannot keep secrets. He cannot maintain composure. He makes terrible decisions under pressure. But he also offers something that the low-risk asset cannot: the willingness to know Emma fully and love her anyway. This is the return that the conservative portfolio sacrifices, the return of being known. And the question the film poses is whether this return is worth the risk. The institutional answer is no. The human answer, as the film's ending suggests, is yes. This brings us to one final dimension of the insurance policy theory that connects to the sociology of trust. In sociological theory, trust is understood as the willingness to accept vulnerability based on positive expectations of another's behavior. Trust is inherently risky. To trust someone is to expose yourself to the possibility of betrayal. The institutional cultural position, with its emphasis on risk minimization and brand covenant compliance, is fundamentally antitrust. It does not permit vulnerability. It does not permit exposure. It does not permit the kind of radical openness that trust requires. The insurance policy model reinforces this antitrust orientation by selecting for partners who minimize vulnerability rather than partners who earn trust through the acceptance of vulnerability. The drama subverts this model entirely. Emma's revelation is an act of trust, a willingness to expose her worst self to the people closest to her. Charlie's eventual acceptance of Emma is an act of trust, a willingness to remain vulnerable to a person who has proven capable of containing violence. The film's ending, in which both characters choose each other with full knowledge of each other's worst qualities, is the ultimate act of trust, a commitment to mutual vulnerability that the institutional cultural position would never permit. And the fact that this act of trust occurs only within the licensed vulnerability space of fiction, only within the protective frame of a film, tells us everything we need to know about the structural constraints that the insurance policy theory describes. In the real world, the insurance policy holds. In the fictional world, it is allowed to fail. And in its failure, something more human, more fragile, and more valuable emerges. The insurance policy theory, properly understood, is not a cynical framework. It is a descriptive one. It describes the structural forces that shape celebrity romance in the contemporary cultural economy. It explains why certain partnerships form and persist. It explains why certain partnerships never form at all. And it reveals, with uncomfortable clarity, the cost of institutional compliance, the sacrifice of authentic intimacy that the institutional cultural position demands as the price of its extraordinary rewards. Tom Holland is the insurance policy. The drama is the claim against it. And the premium, the ongoing, invisible, soul-shaping premium, is paid every day by the person who occupies the position in the currency of unlived life. Let us now consider several additional dimensions of the insurance policy theory that deepen its explanatory power and extend its application beyond the specific case of Zendaya and Holland. The first dimension concerns the concept of moral hazard, which is a central problem in insurance economics. Moral hazard occurs when the existence of insurance changes the behavior of the insured party, making them more likely to engage in risky behavior because they know they are protected against the consequences. In the context of the insurance policy theory of celebrity romance, moral hazard would manifest as the position holder taking greater institutional risks, expressing more controversial opinions, choosing more provocative roles, behaving more authentically in public, because they know that their partner's stabilizing presence will absorb or mitigate the reputational consequences. The question is whether Holland's insurance function creates moral hazard for Zendaya. Does the stability he provides enable her to take risks she would not otherwise take? The answer, when we examine her career trajectory, appears to be yes. Zendaya's willingness to take roles like Rue in Euphoria, a character defined by addiction, self-destruction, and emotional volatility, and Emma in The Drama, a character defined by the capacity for mass violence, may be enabled, at least in part, by the stabilizing presence of Holland in her personal life. The insurance policy gives her room to maneuver within the licensed vulnerability space of film because her off-screen life is so thoroughly protected. This is a fascinating inversion of the traditional moral hazard problem. In insurance economics, moral hazard is typically viewed as negative, as a distortion that increases the overall risk in the system. But in the context of the institutional cultural position, moral hazard may be positive. It may enable the position holder to take creative risks that increase the cultural and economic value of her career while being protected against the reputational downside. Holland's stability does not make Zendaya reckless. It makes her brave. It gives her the institutional security to explore dimensions of human experience, addiction, violence, moral complexity, that the institutional cultural position would otherwise prohibit. The insurance policy does not just protect the position, it expands the creative range of the person who occupies it. The second dimension concerns the concept of reinsurance, the practice of insurance companies purchasing insurance for themselves to protect against catastrophic losses. In the celebrity economy, reinsurance takes the form of secondary stabilizing mechanisms that protect the partnership itself against dissolution. These mechanisms include shared professional projects, like the Spider-Man franchise, which gives Zendaya and Holland a professional reason to maintain the relationship, even if the personal dimension encounters difficulty. Shared social networks, mutual friends and professional associates, whose relationships would be disrupted by a breakup, creating social pressure to maintain the partnership. And the sunk cost of public relationship capital, the accumulated media coverage, joint interviews, coordinated public appearances, and shared brand identity that would be lost in a dissolution. Each of these mechanisms functions as a layer of reinsurance, an additional buffer against the catastrophic loss that a high-profile breakup would represent for both partners' institutional positions. The third dimension concerns the temporal structure of the insurance policy. Insurance policies have terms. They are issued for specific periods and must be renewed. The insurance policy theory suggests that celebrity romantic partnerships operate on a similar temporal structure, though the renewal process is continuous rather than periodic. Every public appearance, every joint interview, every coordinated social media post is a renewal of the insurance policy, a reaffirmation of the partnership's stability and its continued risk-reducing function. The absence of these renewal signals is itself a risk signal. When celebrity couples stop appearing together in public, when they stop posting about each other on social media, when they stop doing joint interviews, the market interprets these absences as evidence that the insurance policy is lapsing, that the partnership may be dissolving. This interpretation triggers a speculative response in the media and among audiences, which creates the very instability that the absence of renewal signals was interpreted as predicting. The renewal process is, in this sense, performative. The performance of partnership stability produces partnership stability. The insurance policy is self-fulfilling. The fourth and final dimension concerns the gendered asymmetry of the insurance policy theory. In the contemporary celebrity economy, the insurance function operates differently for male and female position holders. Female occupants of institutional cultural positions face significantly greater reputational risk from their romantic partnerships than male occupants. A male celebrity who dates a controversial partner faces media scrutiny, but the scrutiny rarely threatens his institutional position. A female celebrity who dates a controversial partner faces not only media scrutiny, but a specific form of moral judgment that connects her partner's behavior to her own character, as if the choice of partner reveals something essential about who she is. This gendered asymmetry means that the insurance function is more important, more constraining, and more structurally determinative for female position holders. Zendaya needs Holland's insurance function more than a male occupant of an equivalent position would need an equivalent partner, because the reputational consequences of a partner-generated scandal are greater for women than for men. This is not a natural fact. It is a structural feature of the gendered double standard that operates in the American media economy. But it is a fact nonetheless, and the insurance policy theory must account for it. This gendered asymmetry also connects to the dynamics we observed in the drama itself. When Charlie kisses Misha, the consequences fall primarily on Emma, not on Charlie. It is Emma who panics when she learns that Misha knows about the school shooting. It is Emma who confronts Misha. It is Emma whose social position is threatened by the spreading of her secret. Charlie's betrayal, his inability to keep the secret, his emotional collapse with Misha, the kiss, is narrated primarily through its impact on Emma rather than through its impact on Charlie himself. The film reproduces, within its fiction, the gendered asymmetry that the insurance policy theory describes. The female partner bears the greater reputational cost of the male partner's institutional failure. Emma needs an insurance policy more than Charlie does, and the film dramatizes what happens when the insurance policy is not only absent, but actively working against her. The insurance policy theory, taken as a whole, offers a framework for understanding celebrity romance that is fundamentally different from the frameworks that dominate popular discussion. The popular discussion treats celebrity romance as a matter of personal compatibility, mutual attraction, and emotional connection, the same framework applied to ordinary relationships. The insurance policy theory does not deny these personal dimensions, but it argues that they operate within a structural context that profoundly shapes their expression. The structural context is the institutional cultural position and its risk management requirements. Within this context, romantic choice is not free. It is constrained, shaped by institutional selection pressures that favor certain types of partners and disfavor others, that reward certain forms of partnership and punish others, and that ultimately determine which relationships are possible, which are sustainable, and which are structurally foreclosed before they can even begin. Tom Holland is the insurance policy that Zendaya's institutional cultural position requires. He is the actuarial ideal, the partner whose specific combination of traits minimizes the expected loss function of the position. But he is also, and this is the insurance policy theory's most unsettling implication, a product of the same system that produces the institutional cultural position itself. He did not choose to be an insurance policy any more than Zendaya chose to need one. Both of them are operating within a structural logic that they did not create and that they cannot fully control. The system produces the position produces the constraint produces the partner, and the partner, by fulfilling the insurance function, reinforces the system that created the need for insurance in the first place. It is a closed loop, elegant, self-sustaining, and, in its deepest implications, a profound commentary on the limits of freedom within the contemporary cultural economy. There is a paradox at the center of aspirational celebrity that no existing framework in media studies, psychology, or cultural criticism has adequately resolved. The paradox is this: the contemporary audience demands authenticity from the very figures whose institutional positions make authenticity impossible. The audience wants to see the real Zendaya. They want to see her struggle, doubt, fail, rage, grieve, and stumble. They want to feel that the person behind the curated Instagram feed, the flawless red carpet appearances, and the carefully managed press interviews is a human being with the same messy, contradictory interior life that they themselves possess. But the institutional cultural position, as we established in Section 4, cannot permit this. The real Zendaya, whatever she is, whoever she is when no one is performing, must remain invisible, because the position depends on the performance of aspirational perfection, and perfection, by definition, excludes the real. This paradox creates a structural problem that the cultural economy must solve, because the demand for authenticity is not optional. It is a market force. Audiences who feel that a celebrity is inauthentic will disengage, and disengagement threatens the economic value of the institutional cultural position. The economy needs a mechanism that satisfies the demand for authenticity without actually breaching the institutional performance. That mechanism is film, and the specific form it takes is what we have been calling the licensed vulnerability space, a concept that we introduced in Section 4, but that deserves, in this section, a full and rigorous theoretical treatment. The licensed vulnerability space is a zone of cultural production in which the occupant of an institutional cultural position is permitted to express dimensions of human experience that the position otherwise suppresses. The key word is permitted. The licensed vulnerability space does not exist because the position holder decides to be vulnerable. It exists because the cultural economy has designated certain contexts, film, television, and to a lesser extent, music and literature, as zones in which vulnerability is institutionally sanctioned. Within these zones, the position holder can express darkness, complexity, moral ambiguity, emotional extremity, and even ugliness without triggering the institutional risk calculus that would penalize identical expressions in any other context. The licensed vulnerability space is, in this sense, a pressure release valve, a structural mechanism that prevents the institutional cultural position from destroying the person who occupies it by providing a controlled outlet for the human complexity that the position suppresses. To understand why film specifically serves this function, we must examine the semiotic structure of cinematic performance. In semiotics, the study of signs and meaning, a sign consists of a signifier, the form that the sign takes, and a signified, the concept or meaning that the sign represents. In film, the actor's body and voice are the signifier, and the character is the signified. The audience processes the actor's performance through what we might call the fictional frame, a cognitive schema that separates the actor from the character and assigns the character's actions, emotions, and moral qualities to the fictional world rather than to the actor's real-world identity. This fictional frame is the structural foundation of the licensed vulnerability space. It allows the audience to witness Zendaya expressing rage, fear, moral compromise, and the capacity for violence without attributing those qualities to Zendaya herself. The audience knows, at a cognitive level, that what they are seeing is a performance. They know that Emma Harwood is not Zendaya, and this knowledge, this activation of the fictional frame, is what licenses the vulnerability. The vulnerability is real in the sense that the emotions are genuinely felt and genuinely communicated, but it is fictional in the sense that the attribution of those emotions is directed to the character, not to the person. However, and this is where the analysis becomes genuinely complex, the fictional frame is not a perfect barrier. It is permeable. Audiences do not maintain a clean cognitive separation between actor and character. They leak, they project, they read the actor through the character and the character through the actor. When they see Zendaya playing Emma Harwood, a woman who carries a terrible secret, who is punished for her past, who's defined by others in terms she cannot control, they cannot entirely prevent themselves from wondering whether the performance reveals something about the performer. This permeability is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The licensed vulnerability space works precisely because the fictional frame is permeable, because the audience gets to feel that they are seeing something real about Zendaya while simultaneously maintaining the cognitive alibi that they are only watching a character. The permeability satisfies the demand for authenticity. The fictional frame protects the institutional cultural position. Both functions are served simultaneously, and the tension between them, the shimmer between real and fictional, between actor and character, between performance and revelation, is itself a source of audience engagement that generates economic value. Let us now examine how the drama specifically exploits the licensed vulnerability space through a close reading of the transcript, because the film is calibrated with extraordinary precision to maximize the value of this mechanism. Consider the emotional architecture of Emma Harwood as a character. Emma is constructed around a specific set of vulnerabilities that resonate with the suppressed dimensions of Zendaya's institutional cultural position. Emma carries a secret that, if revealed, will destroy her social world. Zendaya carries the burden of an institutional image that, if breached, will destroy her cultural position. Emma must perform normalcy, must appear kind, warm, stable, and non-threatening, while concealing an interior reality that contradicts the performance. Zendaya must perform aspirational perfection while concealing whatever interior complexity, doubt, fatigue, or dissatisfaction the position suppresses. Emma is punished when her secret is revealed, punished not for what she did not actually carry out the shooting, but for what she was capable of, for the fact that the capacity for violence existed within her at all. Zendaya would be punished if her institutional performance were ever breached, punished not for any specific act, but for the revelation that she is not, in fact, the flawless, aspirational figure the position requires her to be. These structural parallels are not accidental. They are the mechanism through which the licensed vulnerability space generates its value. By playing a character whose situation structurally mirrors her own institutional predicament, Zendaya is able to process, and the audience is able to witness her processing, emotions and experiences that are directly relevant to her real-world condition, but that cannot be expressed in any other context. When Emma sits across from Charlie after the revelation and says, "I do not want you to fixate on this," the line operates on two registers simultaneously. On the fictional register, Emma is asking her fiancé to move past a horrifying disclosure. On the metatextual register, Zendaya is expressing the anxiety that every occupant of an institutional cultural position carries. The anxiety that any deviation from the institutional performance will become the thing that defines them, the thing that people fixate on, the thing that replaces the carefully constructed image with something uncontrolled and uncontrollable. The transcript reveals moment after moment of this dual register operation. When Emma tries to role-play a fresh encounter with Charlie, approaching him in their own home, pretending they have never met, asking his name, flirting, she's not merely trying to restart their sexual relationship. She's trying to perform the version of herself that existed before the revelation, the clean version, the institutionally compliant version. She is trying to put the mask back on. And when Charlie says this is not going to work, when he refuses to participate in the performance, when he insists on confronting the reality beneath the mask, the scene becomes a dramatization of the moment that every occupant of an institutional cultural position fears most, the moment when someone refuses to accept the performance and demands the person underneath. Consider also the scene where Emma reacts to the news of a mass shooting while at work. A coworker says there is a shooting at the mall, and Emma responds with, "Oh my God, I was just there." She performs the expected emotional response: shock, horror, disbelief. But then the conversation shifts. A coworker says that it was not technically a mass shooting because only 3 people died, and you need 4 or more for the designation. Emma does not challenge this. She absorbs it. And then Charlie, in a later conversation, makes the devastating observation, "That is the reason you did not do it, because someone else just got there first." The scene operates on the fictional register as a confrontation about Emma's motives, but on the metatextual register, it dramatizes the way that occupants of institutional cultural positions must continuously perform emotional responses that may or may not correspond to their actual feelings. Emma must perform horror at gun violence while concealing the fact that she once planned to commit it. Zendaya must perform aspirational joy while concealing whatever emotional reality the institutional cultural position suppresses. The licensed vulnerability space also operates through the physical register, through the body rather than through dialogue. The transcript notes moments where Emma is physically expressive in ways that the institutional cultural position would never permit Zendaya to be in public. Emma vomits. Emma snaps at a driver in a crosswalk. Emma slaps Charlie. Emma cries in a way that is ugly and uncontrolled, not the photogenic single tear of the aspirational performance, but the full-body convulsion of genuine distress. These physical expressions are forms of vulnerability that the institutional cultural position suppresses absolutely. Zendaya does not vomit in public. She does not snap at strangers. She does not slap anyone. She does not cry in a way that is not beautiful. The film provides a space in which these suppressed physical expressions can occur, and the audience, processing them through the permeable fictional frame, receives them as evidence of Zendaya's range, depth, and humanity, evidence that satisfies the demand for authenticity without breaching the institutional performance. This brings us to a concept that we might call emotional arbitrage, the exploitation of a price difference between two markets. In financial markets, arbitrage is the practice of buying an asset in one market where it is cheap and selling it in another market where it is expensive, profiting from the difference. In the cultural economy, emotional arbitrage is the practice of expressing emotions in the licensed vulnerability space, where they are institutionally cheap, where they carry no reputational cost, and harvesting the value of those emotions in the real-world market, where they are institutionally expensive, where they would carry enormous reputational cost if expressed directly. Zendaya performs rage, fear, moral complexity, and physical vulnerability in the drama at zero institutional cost. But the value of those performances, measured in critical acclaim, audience engagement, discourse generation, and the reinforcement of her cultural relevance, accrues to her real-world institutional cultural position. She gets the benefit of authenticity without paying the price of authenticity. This is emotional arbitrage, and it is one of the most sophisticated economic mechanisms operating in the contemporary cultural economy. The concept of emotional arbitrage connects to the broader economic framework of regulatory arbitrage, the practice of structuring transactions to exploit differences in regulatory regimes. In regulatory arbitrage, a firm conducts an activity in a jurisdiction where it is legal or lightly regulated, while selling the output of that activity in a jurisdiction where it would be heavily regulated or prohibited. The licensed vulnerability space operates on exactly this principle. Film is the jurisdiction where vulnerability is legal. Public life is the jurisdiction where vulnerability is prohibited. By conducting vulnerability in the film jurisdiction and selling its output, critical acclaim, audience connection, discourse value, in the public life jurisdiction, the performer extracts value from a regulatory asymmetry that would otherwise be impossible to exploit. Let us now consider the specific way that the drama's narrative structure maximizes the value of the licensed vulnerability space for Zendaya. The film is structured around a single revelation, Emma's confession that she planned a school shooting, and the cascading consequences of that revelation across her entire social world. This structure is significant because it mirrors, at the narrative level, the structure of the position holder's deepest fear. The fear that a single breach of the institutional performance will cascade through the entire system of relationships, professional associations, and public perceptions that constitute the position. The film dramatizes a total system failure, the complete collapse of social trust triggered by a single piece of information, and it places Zendaya at the center of that collapse. The transcript traces the cascade with meticulous precision. The revelation occurs at the wine tasting. Rachel reacts with immediate moral absolutism. Charlie tries to process but begins to unravel. Rachel withdraws from the wedding and calls Emma at night to say she is not coming. Rachel tells her husband Mike, who already knows. Charlie asks Misha a hypothetical question about school shootings, effectively leaking the information. Misha tells her boyfriend Blake. Rachel delivers a maid of honor speech laced with coded hostility, calling Emma full of surprises and describing Charlie as a real cheerleader with the sarcasm barely concealed. Misha is overheard on the phone at the wedding saying the words school shooting and do not tell anyone. Emma overhears and panics. The information spreads through the wedding like a contagion, and by the time Charlie delivers his speech, the entire event has been contaminated by the secret. The cascade is complete. The system has failed. This cascading failure is the licensed vulnerability space operating at maximum intensity. Zendaya, through the character of Emma, gets to experience the total collapse of social trust, to feel what it would feel like if the institutional performance were breached and the entire system turned against her. She gets to feel the panic when Misha is overheard. She gets to feel the betrayal when Rachel delivers her passive-aggressive speech. She gets to feel the isolation of being surrounded by people who know her worst secret and are judging her for it. She gets to feel all of this, and the audience gets to witness her feeling it, and the institutional cultural position remains intact because it is happening to Emma Harwood, not to Zendaya. But the permeability of the fictional frame means that the audience does not entirely separate the two. They watch Emma's world collapse, and they feel a frisson of recognition, a sense that they are seeing, through the permeable barrier of fiction, something that is real about the performer's inner life. Not the specific content, Zendaya did not plan a school shooting, but the emotional structure, the fear of exposure, the terror of being defined by your worst quality, the desperation to maintain a performance of normalcy while the foundation beneath it crumbles. These are emotions that any occupant of an institutional cultural position must feel, and the licensed vulnerability space allows them to be expressed without being acknowledged. The expression is real, the acknowledgement is fictional, and the gap between expression and acknowledgement is the space in which the licensed vulnerability generates its value. There is a philosophical dimension here that connects to the existentialist tradition, particularly to the work of Jean-Paul Sartre on bad faith. Sartre defined bad faith as the act of deceiving oneself about one's own freedom, of pretending that one is bound by circumstances or roles when one is actually free to choose otherwise. The institutional cultural position is, in Sartre's framework, a structure of bad faith. The position holder pretends that she must be the aspirational, perfect, institutionally compliant version of herself, that the position's requirements are fixed constraints rather than choices that she continuously makes. The licensed vulnerability space is the moment when the bad faith temporarily dissolves, when the performer, through the protective frame of fiction, acknowledges the dimensions of selfhood that the bad faith suppresses. Emma Harwood is Zendaya's moment of good faith, the moment when the performer stops pretending that she is only what the institution requires her to be and allows the suppressed dimensions of her humanity to surface. But even this good faith operates within a structure of bad faith, because the performer knows, and the audience knows, that the good faith is temporary. The credits will roll, the mask will go back on, the institutional performance will resume. The licensed vulnerability space is not an escape from the institutional cultural position. It is a feature of it, a structural mechanism that the position produces and controls. The position permits vulnerability in the same way that a pressure cooker permits the release of steam, not to liberate the contents, but to prevent the container from exploding. The vulnerability is functional. It serves the position. And the performer, even in the moment of her most authentic self-expression, is still performing, still serving the institution, still generating value for the system that constrains her. This recursive structure, vulnerability that serves the institution that suppresses vulnerability, is the deepest and most unsettling insight of the licensed vulnerability space framework. It suggests that there is no outside to the institutional cultural position. Even the moments that feel most real, most authentic, most free, are structurally integrated into the institution's logic of value creation. The performer cannot escape the position by being vulnerable in a film, because the vulnerability in the film reinforces the position by satisfying the audience's demand for authenticity, which strengthens their engagement with the performer, which increases the economic value of the position, which tightens the constraints that make the licensed vulnerability space necessary in the first place. It is a perfect closed system, a system in which every apparent escape route leads back to the center. The drama is the most transparent illustration of this closed system that the contemporary entertainment industry has produced. It is a film about a woman who cannot escape her past, who carries a secret that defines her regardless of how much she has changed, and it stars a performer who cannot escape her position, who carries an institutional identity that defines her regardless of what she actually feels or wants or needs. The structural resonance between narrative and performer is not incidental. It is the source of the film's emotional power, its commercial value, and its discursive potency. When audiences watch the drama, they are watching two stories simultaneously: the story of Emma Harwood, a woman trapped by her worst moment, and the story of Zendaya, a performer trapped by her best image. The licensed vulnerability space is the membrane between these two stories, the thin, permeable barrier that allows the audience to sense the second story through the first without ever having to acknowledge it directly. This is why the drama works. Not because it is a great film, the critical consensus is divided on that question, but because it activates the licensed vulnerability space with a precision and a depth that few films achieve. It gives the audience what they want, a glimpse of the real person behind the institutional performance, while protecting what the institution needs, the performance itself. It satisfies the demand for authenticity without breaching the supply of perfection. And it does all of this through the simple, ancient, endlessly powerful mechanism of storytelling, the mechanism through which human beings have always processed the emotions they cannot express directly, the truths they cannot speak openly, and the dimensions of selfhood they cannot acknowledge without the protective frame of Once Upon a Time. Emma Harwood is Zendaya's Once Upon a Time, and the audience, leaning forward in the dark of the theater, recognizes the truth of it even as they agree to call it fiction. That recognition, that shimmer between real and imagined, between performer and character, between what is shown and what is meant, is the licensed vulnerability space in its purest form. And it is worth, in the economy of the institutional cultural position, more than any role, any award, or any number on a box office report. It is worth the momentary experience of being fully, terrifyingly, beautifully human. And then it is over, and the position resumes, and the performance continues. And the next film, whenever it comes, will offer another brief window of licensed humanity. Until then, the mask holds, the institution endures, and the person beneath waits, as she always has, for permission to exist. We must now examine a dimension of the licensed vulnerability space that has not yet been addressed, and it concerns the relationship between the performer's body and the institution's image. The institutional cultural position does not merely regulate behavior and speech. It regulates the body. It regulates how the body is presented, how it moves, how it is photographed, how it is dressed, and what physical states it is permitted to display. The body of the position holder is, in a very real sense, institutional property, a surface on which the institution inscribes its requirements. The body must be beautiful, according to the specific standards that the position demands. It must be thin, but not too thin. It must be fit, but not aggressively muscular. It must be dressed in ways that communicate luxury, sophistication, and effortless elegance. It must never appear sweaty, exhausted, bloated, sick, injured, or physically compromised in any way that would undermine the aspirational image. The body, in short, must be perfect. And perfection, as anyone who has ever inhabited a body knows, is a lie. The licensed vulnerability space of film permits the body to tell the truth. In the drama, Emma's body does things that Zendaya's institutional body is never permitted to do. Emma vomits, a violent, uncontrollable, physically humiliating act that the institutional cultural position would never allow to be associated with Zendaya's public image. The transcript captures this moment at the wedding when the accumulated stress of the week, the revelation, the cascading social consequences, Charlie's deterioration, Rachel's hostility, overwhelms Emma's body and produces a physical response that cannot be managed, curated, or aestheticized. Vomiting is the anti-aspiration. It is the body rebelling against the performance, the physical self refusing to cooperate with the institutional self. And within the licensed vulnerability space, this rebellion is permitted. It is even celebrated. Critics praise the rawness of the performance, the willingness to be unglamorous, the courage to show the body in a state of distress. The same physical act that would be catastrophic for the institutional cultural position becomes a source of critical acclaim when it occurs within the fictional frame. This connects to a tradition in feminist film theory that examines the relationship between the female body and the cinematic gaze. Laura Mulvey's foundational essay on visual pleasure argued that mainstream cinema positions the female body as an object of the male gaze, a spectacle to be looked at rather than a subject who looks. The licensed vulnerability space complicates this framework by creating a context in which the female body is permitted to be a subject, to express distress, ugliness, and physical vulnerability in ways that disrupt the objectifying gaze. When Emma vomits, she's not being looked at in the way that the institutional cultural position normally requires Zendaya to be looked at. She is being witnessed. And witnessing is a fundamentally different mode of audience engagement than gazing. Gazing is consumptive. It extracts pleasure from the spectacle. Witnessing is relational. It creates a bond between the viewer and the viewed based on shared vulnerability. The licensed vulnerability space converts the gaze into witnessing, and this conversion is one of the mechanisms through which it generates its distinctive emotional and economic value. Consider also the scene in the transcript where Emma and Charlie attempt to have sex after the revelation, and Charlie cannot perform. This scene is remarkable for what it reveals about the physical dimension of the licensed vulnerability space. The sexual body is the most heavily regulated dimension of the institutional cultural position's body management regime. Zendaya's sexual body must always be presented within very specific parameters. It must be desirable but not explicit, sensual but not vulgar, powerful but not threatening. The film permits a departure from these parameters by dramatizing sexual failure, by showing a body that cannot perform the function that the institution normally requires it to perform. Charlie's impotence is, on the fictional register, a consequence of his inability to reconcile his desire for Emma with his knowledge of her past. But on the metatextual register, it dramatizes the broader failure of institutional performance, the moment when the body refuses to cooperate with the demands being placed on it. The institution says, "Be desirable." The body says, "I cannot." This rebellion of the body against institutional demands is one of the most powerful forms of vulnerability that the licensed vulnerability space permits. The scene unfolds with excruciating precision in the transcript. Emma says she feels like Charlie needs to stop thinking about it. Charlie responds that she cannot tell him to stop thinking about it. Emma suggests starting over. She then attempts the role play, pretending to meet Charlie for the first time, asking his name, flirting. The attempt fails. Charlie says this is not going to work. The scene dramatizes the impossibility of performing intimacy when the conditions for genuine intimacy have been destroyed. It is a scene about the failure of performance itself, about the moment when the institutional self and the authentic self diverge so completely that the performance cannot be sustained. For a performer whose entire public life is a sustained performance, this is the ultimate vulnerability, the dramatization of what it feels like when the performance breaks down. There is also a sociological dimension to the licensed vulnerability space that connects to Irving Goffman's dramaturgical theory of social interaction. Goffman argued that social life is fundamentally theatrical, that individuals perform roles in front of audiences, managing their presentations of self to create desired impressions. Goffman distinguished between the front stage, where performances are given, and the backstage, where performers can relax the performance and be themselves. The institutional cultural position is unique in that it has no backstage. The position holder is always on the front stage, always performing, always managing impressions, always subject to the evaluative gaze of the audience. Social media has eliminated the physical backstage. There is no private space that cannot be photographed and posted. The 24-hour news cycle has eliminated the temporal backstage. There is no time of day when the performance can be suspended. The institutional cultural position has converted all of life into front stage. The licensed vulnerability space is, in Goffman's framework, the creation of an artificial backstage within the front stage. Film creates a space that looks like backstage, that feels like a glimpse behind the performance, while actually being another form of front stage activity. The audience experiences it as access to the performer's private self, but it is, structurally, a carefully managed public performance. This is the genius of the licensed vulnerability space. It creates the phenomenological experience of backstage access within the structural reality of continuous front stage performance. The audience feels that they have seen behind the mask. They have not. They have seen another mask, a mask shaped like vulnerability, a mask that performs the absence of performance. But the feeling of access is genuine, and genuine feelings produce genuine engagement, and genuine engagement produces genuine economic value. The licensed vulnerability space is, in this sense, the most sophisticated form of impression management that the cultural economy has ever produced. It manages the impression of impression management's absence. Let us also consider the way the licensed vulnerability space interacts with the discourse metastasis architecture described in Section 1. The vulnerability that Zendaya expresses through Emma Harwood does not merely satisfy the audience's demand for authenticity. It generates discourse. When audiences see Zendaya in a role that seems to reveal something about her real self, when they debate whether Emma's restraint reflects Zendaya's own emotional containment, when they discuss whether the film's racial dynamics map onto Zendaya's own experience of racial ambiguity, when they argue about whether the character's capacity for violence says something about the performer's hidden depths, they are generating the discourse that drives the film's marketing architecture. The licensed vulnerability space feeds the discourse metastasis engine by providing material for speculation, interpretation, and debate. And the more ambiguous the relationship between performer and character, the more permeable the fictional frame, the more discourse is generated. This is why Zendaya's casting in the drama is commercially optimal. Her institutional cultural position creates maximum ambiguity about the relationship between the performer's institutional self and the character's authentic self, and this ambiguity generates maximum discourse. The licensed vulnerability space, properly understood, is not a creative choice. It is an economic necessity. It is the mechanism through which the institutional cultural position manages the contradiction between the demand for authenticity and the requirement of perfection. It is the pressure release valve that prevents the position from destroying the person. It is the artificial backstage that maintains the illusion of access while preserving the structure of continuous performance. It is the emotional arbitrage engine that extracts value from vulnerability without paying the institutional cost. And it is, above all, the space in which the human being at the center of the institution is permitted, for a brief and controlled moment, to exist, not as an icon, not as an aspiration, not as a brand, but as a person, flawed, complex, dangerous, afraid, and real. The drama is that space, and its value, to Zendaya, to A24, to the audience, and to the cultural economy that all of them inhabit, is incalculable. Robert Pattinson is not supposed to be in this film, or rather, Robert Pattinson is not supposed to be the kind of actor who is in this film. He is supposed to be Edward Cullen, the impossibly beautiful, eternally frozen, romantically tortured vampire who defined an entire generation of feminine desire. He is supposed to be the object of a specific kind of gaze, the gaze of the teenage girl who projects onto his marble-pale face the totality of her romantic imagination. He is supposed to be safe, desirable, aspirational, and above all, consumable, a product designed for a specific market segment and optimized for that segment's emotional needs. That is what Twilight made him. That is what the cultural economy intended him to be. And everything Robert Pattinson has done since Twilight has been an elaborate, systematic, often self-destructive campaign to destroy that intention. This campaign is one of the most fascinating case studies in anti-institutional branding that the contemporary entertainment industry has produced, and it is central to understanding how the drama functions as a marketing architecture, because Pattinson's presence in the film activates a form of capital that is distinct from anything we have discussed so far. We are going to call it nostalgia capital, and we are going to demonstrate that it operates as a hidden subsidy that reduces the marketing cost of the film while simultaneously generating discourse through the collision between who Pattinson was and who Pattinson has become. Let us begin with nostalgia capital as a concept. In economics, capital refers to assets that can be deployed to generate future returns. Financial capital generates returns through investment. Human capital generates returns through skills and knowledge. Social capital generates returns through relationships and networks. Cultural capital, as Pierre Bourdieu defined it, generates returns through knowledge of and access to prestigious cultural forms. Nostalgia capital is a distinct form of capital that generates returns through the audience's emotional attachment to a performer's past identity. It is the accumulated residue of prior cultural consumption, the memories, emotions, associations, and identity investments that an audience has made in a performer's earlier work, and it can be deployed by the performer, or by the cultural products that feature the performer, to generate attention, engagement, and economic value. Pattinson's nostalgia capital is enormous. Twilight was not merely a successful film franchise, it was a generational identity event, a cultural phenomenon that shaped the romantic imaginations, aesthetic preferences, and social behaviors of millions of young women during a formative period of their psychological development. The women who were 14 when Twilight was released in 2008 are now 32. They have grown up, they have careers, relationships, children, mortgages. They have moved far beyond the emotional landscape of their teenage selves. But the emotional investment they made in Edward Cullen, the hours spent reading the books, watching the films, arguing about Team Edward versus Team Jacob, projecting their desires onto Pattinson's face, has not disappeared. It has been converted into nostalgia capital, a stored emotional asset that can be activated by any cultural product that features Pattinson and that connects, however obliquely, to the emotional register of Twilight. The drama activates this nostalgia capital with surgical precision. The film is, at its structural core, a romance, a story about a couple navigating the complexities of love, trust, and commitment in the days before their wedding. This romantic framework connects directly to the emotional register that Twilight established for Pattinson's audience. The women who loved Edward Cullen loved him because he represented a specific ideal of romantic devotion, the partner who would sacrifice everything, endure anything, and love unconditionally. Charlie Thompson, Pattinson's character in the drama, is a grotesque inversion of this ideal. He is a partner who cannot handle the truth about his beloved, who unravels under the pressure of moral complexity, who betrays Emma's trust by sharing her secret with a colleague, who kisses that colleague in a moment of emotional collapse, and who delivers a wedding speech that disintegrates into public confession and self-flagellation. Charlie is Edward Cullen's nightmare, the version of the romantic hero who fails at the precise moment when heroism is required. This inversion is commercially powerful because it generates a specific form of discourse that is driven by nostalgia capital. The audience that carries the nostalgia capital, the women who grew up with Twilight, watches Charlie's failure through the lens of Edward Cullen's perfection. They cannot help but compare. They cannot help but feel the gap between who Pattinson was, the perfect romantic hero, and who Pattinson is playing, the catastrophically imperfect romantic failure. And this gap, this cognitive and emotional dissonance, produces discourse. It produces posts on social media. It produces conversations with friends. It produces podcast discussions and think pieces and TikTok videos. Each piece of discourse is a marketing asset for the film, and each marketing asset is powered, in part, by the nostalgia capital that Twilight deposited in the audience's emotional bank account nearly 2 decades ago. A24 understood this dynamic and exploited it with extraordinary sophistication. The marketing campaign included a wedding hoodie that featured an oversized graphic of Pattinson as Edward Cullen alongside Zendaya from a Challenger's red carpet, a deliberately garish, ironic juxtaposition that acknowledged the nostalgia capital explicitly while simultaneously mocking it. This is a marketing gesture that operates on multiple levels. For the audience that carries the nostalgia capital, it is a wink, a recognition of their emotional history with Pattinson, an acknowledgement that A24 knows who they are and what they feel. For the audience that does not carry the nostalgia capital, younger viewers, male viewers, viewers who came to Pattinson through the Batman or his art house work, the hoodie is a provocation, a piece of ironic merchandise that signals the film's self-awareness and cultural sophistication. In both cases, the hoodie generates attention and discourse. It is a piece of marketing that markets itself, powered by the nostalgia capital that Pattinson's career has accumulated. Now, let us examine the second dimension of Pattinson's relevance to the drama, his anti-institutional branding strategy. If Zendaya represents the apotheosis of institutional compliance, the performer who has perfectly internalized the requirements of the institutional cultural position, Pattinson represents the exact opposite, the performer who has systematically dismantled his institutional identity and rebuilt it as something the institution never intended. Pattinson's post-Twilight career is a case study in what we might call brand destruction as brand construction, the deliberate demolition of a commercially valuable public identity in order to create a new identity that is valued precisely because it represents the rejection of the old one. The mechanics of this strategy are worth examining in detail because they reveal a form of value creation that is structurally different from anything in the standard marketing playbook. After Twilight, Pattinson had 2 options. The first was to leverage his Twilight identity into a conventional leading man career, to play romantic heroes, to star in mainstream franchise films, to maintain the handsome, brooding, desirable persona that Twilight had established. This was the institutional path, and it would have generated predictable, stable, but ultimately diminishing returns as the Twilight nostalgia faded and new romantic heroes emerged to replace him. The second option was to destroy the Twilight identity entirely, to take roles that were so far from Edward Cullen, so aggressively anti-romantic, so committed to the demolition of physical and psychological beauty, that the audience would be forced to recategorize him. Pattinson chose the second option, and he chose it with a ferocity that bordered on pathological. He worked with David Cronenberg in Cosmopolis and Maps to the Stars. He worked with the Safdie brothers in Good Time, playing a small-time criminal with peroxide blonde hair and a desperate, feral energy that was the antithesis of Edward Cullen's aristocratic stillness. He worked with Robert Eggers in The Lighthouse, delivering a performance of such sustained physical degradation, drenched, filthy, masturbating, screaming, descending into madness, that it became impossible to reconcile the performer on screen with the performer who had once embodied teenage romantic perfection. He worked with Claire Denis in High Life, playing a convict on a death row spaceship. He took role after role that functioned as an act of self-immolation, a deliberate burning of the Twilight identity in order to create something new from the ashes. This strategy is counterintuitive from a traditional marketing perspective. The standard wisdom is that brand equity should be protected and leveraged, not destroyed. A performer who has established a commercially valuable identity should exploit that identity, not demolish it. But Pattinson's strategy reveals a deeper logic that connects to the category context perception engine described in Section 2. By destroying the Twilight identity, Pattinson changed the category against which his performances were evaluated. He was no longer evaluated as a romantic leading man who was attempting serious acting. He was evaluated as a serious actor who had emerged from the wreckage of a franchise career. The categorical shift changed the perception of his performances. Work that might have been considered merely competent if delivered by an established art house actor was perceived as extraordinary when delivered by the former Edward Cullen, because the gap between the categorical expectation, Pretty Boy franchise star, and the actual performance, committed, fearless, physically transformative character work, produced the elevated Q value that the category context perception engine predicts. This is the Buc-ee's effect applied to an acting career. Pattinson did not become a better actor than Daniel Day-Lewis or Philip Seymour Hoffman. He became a Twilight star who acts like Daniel Day-Lewis, and the categorical context made his work seem more remarkable than it would if he had arrived at the same level of craft through a conventional art house trajectory. The destruction of the Twilight brand was not a rejection of commercial logic. It was a sophisticated application of commercial logic, a deliberate manipulation of the category context perception engine to maximize the perceived quality of his performances. Now let us examine how this anti-institutional branding strategy functions within the drama specifically. Pattinson's performance as Charlie Thompson is defined by a quality that critics have identified as self-lacerating, a willingness to make himself pathetic, ridiculous, and physically degraded in the service of the character. The transcript captures this quality with brutal specificity. Charlie cannot write a wedding speech without spiraling into anxiety. He rehearses with Mike, workshopping the tone, debating whether to mention their sex life, crumbling when he realizes he has forgotten everything. He cannot perform sexually after Emma's revelation. The transcript captures him panting, struggling, admitting he is thinking about it when Emma tells him to stop thinking about it. He lies about throwing away a coffee mug. He picks fights over nothing. He accosts Emma's maid of honor's cousin Sam in a restaurant, trying to build a case for why Sam should not be offended by Emma's past. He asks Misha what she would do if her boyfriend planned a school shooting, then cries, then kisses her. He vomits at his own wedding, vomits publicly, spectacularly, in front of every person in his life. He delivers a speech that collapses into incoherence, confessing his inadequacy, his stupidity, his betrayal of Emma with Misha, and shouting at the assembled guests to stop gossiping. And then he gets punched in the face by Blake. This is not the behavior of a romantic hero. This is the behavior of a man in complete institutional collapse, a man whose entire system of self-presentation has failed, who has lost the ability to perform the role that his social position requires. And this is precisely why Pattinson is the perfect actor for the role. His entire post-Twilight career has been a rehearsal for this moment, a systematic training in the art of institutional collapse. He has spent a decade learning how to make himself pathetic on screen, how to strip away the armor of physical beauty and romantic idealization, how to show the audience the sweating, vomiting, crying, failing human being beneath the institutional performance. Charlie Thompson is not a departure from Pattinson's post-Twilight project. He is its culmination, the ultimate expression of the anti-institutional branding strategy applied to the specific context of a romantic drama. The commercial brilliance of casting Pattinson in this role lies in the way it activates both his nostalgia capital and his anti-institutional brand simultaneously. The nostalgia capital draws the Twilight audience to the film, the women who grew up with Edward Cullen and who are now curious to see Pattinson in a wedding film, a romance, a story about love and commitment. The anti-institutional brand delivers a product that is the opposite of what the nostalgia capital led them to expect. Not a romantic hero, but a romantic disaster. Not a fantasy of perfect love, but a brutal, funny, devastating portrait of love under impossible pressure. The gap between expectation and delivery generates the discourse that the discourse metastasis architecture feeds on, and the discourse generates the attention that translates into ticket sales. This dual activation strategy is a specific application of the bait and switch marketing technique that we identified in Section 1, But it operates at a deeper level than the marketing campaign's wedding to school shooting switch. It operates at the level of performer identity. The bait is Pattinson as Edward Cullen, the romantic ideal, the object of nostalgic desire, the promise of a love story. The switch is Pattinson as Charlie Thompson, the anti-romantic, the self-destructing failure, the promise broken. And because this bait and switch operates at the level of performer identity rather than at the level of marketing messaging, it is more powerful, more emotionally resonant, and more discourse generative than any trailer or poster could be. The audience does not merely discover that the film is not what they expected. They discover that Pattinson is not who they remembered. And that discovery, that confrontation between nostalgia and reality, between the frozen image of teenage desire and the sweating, vomiting, failing reality of adult masculinity, is one of the most potent emotional experiences that the film delivers. Let us connect this analysis to the broader theoretical framework we have been building across these sections. In Section 1, we introduced the concept of discourse metastasis, the self-propagating spread of cultural discourse driven by unresolved tensions. In Section 2, we introduced the category context perception engine, the mechanism through which categorical framing manufactures the perception of transcendence from ordinary performance. In Section 3, we introduced racial ambiguity as go-to-market strategy, the use of Zendaya's polymorphic racial identity to segment the market at the point of production. In Section 4, we introduced the institutional cultural position trap, the gilded prison that constrains the position holder's authentic selfhood. In Section 5, we introduced the insurance policy theory, the actuarial logic of celebrity romance. In Section 6, we introduced the licensed vulnerability space, the artificial backstage, where institutional performers are permitted to express suppressed dimensions of their humanity. Pattinson's nostalgia capital and anti-institutional branding strategy connect to all of these frameworks simultaneously. The nostalgia capital feeds the discourse metastasis engine by providing a stored emotional charge that is released when the audience encounters Pattinson in a context that contradicts their nostalgic expectations. The anti-institutional brand exploits the category context perception engine by positioning Pattinson's performances against a categorical expectation, franchise star, that makes them seem more remarkable than they would be in an absolute evaluation. The contrast between Pattinson's anti-institutional trajectory and Zendaya's institutional compliance creates a dialectical tension that enriches the film's racial and gender dynamics. The white male performer who has the privilege to destroy his institutional identity without consequence versus the biracial female performer who cannot afford to let her institutional identity slip for even a moment. Pattinson's self-destruction on screen, as Charlie, functions as a dark mirror to the insurance policy theory, showing what happens when the romantic partner is not an insurance policy, but an accelerant, not a stabilizing force, but a destabilizing one. And his willingness to be pathetic, ridiculous, and physically degraded in the film extends the licensed vulnerability space into new territory, the territory of masculine vulnerability, of male institutional collapse, of the romantic hero revealed as a frightened, incompetent, deeply human failure. This last point deserves particular attention because it connects to a broader cultural conversation about masculinity that the drama engages with but never explicitly names. The Twilight to Pattinson pipeline is stolen in, at its deepest level, a story about the destruction and reconstruction of masculine identity. Edward Cullen represents a specific model of masculinity, the protector, the provider, the eternally devoted partner whose love is so absolute that it transcends death. This model of masculinity is aspirational for the audience that consumes it, but it is also, Pattinson's career suggests, suffocating for the performer who embodies it. It is a mask, another form of the institutional performance that the institutional cultural position demands. And Pattinson's post-Twilight career has been a systematic removal of this mask, a stripping away of the idealized masculine persona to reveal the frightened, uncertain, often ridiculous human being beneath. Charlie Thompson is the endpoint of this stripping process. He is the romantic hero with the mask fully removed. He is not brave. He is not strong. He is not wise. He is not self-assured. He is anxious, confused, impulsive, emotionally incontinent, and physically fragile. He is, in other words, a real man. A man as men actually are when they are not performing the roles that the cultural economy assigns to them. And the audience's response to this real man, the mixture of sympathy, frustration, amusement, and recognition that Charlie provokes, is itself a form of discourse about what masculinity can and should look like in the 21st century. Pattinson's nostalgia capital makes this discourse possible because it provides the before image against which the after can be measured. Without Edward Cullen, Charlie Thompson is just a pathetic man at a wedding. With Edward Cullen, Charlie Thompson is a commentary on the entire architecture of romantic masculinity, a demolition of the fantasy that reveals the reality beneath. The economic value of this commentary is significant. It positions the drama within the ongoing cultural conversation about masculinity that has been generated by the Me Too movement, by the discourse around toxic masculinity, by the growing demand for male emotional vulnerability in romantic relationships. By casting Pattinson, whose career trajectory embodies the transition from idealized masculinity to authentic masculinity, A24 positions the film at the intersection of multiple high-engagement cultural conversations, each of which generates its own stream of discourse. The Twilight audience discusses how Pattinson has changed. The film criticism community discusses his evolution as an actor. The gender studies community discusses the deconstruction of romantic masculinity. The general audience discusses whether Charlie is sympathetic or contemptible. Each of these conversations feeds the discourse metastasis engine, and each is powered, in part, by the nostalgia capital that Twilight deposited and that Pattinson's subsequent career has been both destroying and exploiting for the past 18 years. This brings us to the final, and perhaps most counterintuitive insight of the nostalgia capital framework, that nostalgia capital is most valuable when it is betrayed. A performer who fulfills the audience's nostalgic expectations generates satisfaction but not discourse. A performer who betrays those expectations generates dissonance, and dissonance generates discourse. Pattinson's entire post-Twilight career has been an exercise in nostalgia capital betrayal, a systematic violation of the audience's expectations that converts stored emotional investment into active cultural engagement. Each betrayal generates a new wave of discourse. Each wave of discourse generates new attention, and each wave of attention generates new economic value, not for the Twilight franchise, which received the original investment, but for whatever cultural product Pattinson is currently attached to. The drama is the current beneficiary of this redirected nostalgia capital, and its box office performance, its critical reception, and its cultural footprint all reflect, in part, the enormous stored charge that Pattinson's career has been accumulating and deploying for nearly 2 decades. Nostalgia capital betrayal is, in this sense, a form of creative destruction, Joseph Schumpeter's concept of the process by which new economic structures emerge from the demolition of old ones. Pattinson demolished the Edward Cullen structure, the commercially valuable but artistically constraining romantic hero identity, and from its ruins, he constructed a new identity that is more artistically valuable, more culturally resonant, and, paradoxically, more commercially potent than the original. The demolition was not a loss, it was an investment in a new form of capital that generates returns through contradiction, dissonance, and the productive violation of audience expectations. And the drama is the latest return on that investment, a film that could not exist, could not function, and could not generate the discourse it generates without the 18-year history of construction, demolition, and reconstruction that Pattinson's career represents. The Twilight to Pattinson pipeline is not a career trajectory. It is a financial instrument, a long-dated option on nostalgia capital that appreciates in value with every expectation it betrays. There is a further dimension to this analysis that concerns the gendered asymmetry of nostalgia capital destruction and its implications for the broader cultural economy. Pattinson's ability to destroy his Twilight identity and rebuild his career around anti-institutional authenticity is enabled by a privilege that is specifically masculine. Male performers in Hollywood have far greater latitude to be ugly, pathetic, physically degraded, and morally repulsive on screen without suffering permanent damage to their market value. This latitude is not extended equally to female performers. Zendaya cannot destroy her institutional identity the way Pattinson destroyed his. She cannot take a role in which she is drenched, filthy, screaming, and masturbating, because the reputational cost of such a performance would be asymmetrically greater for a biracial woman occupying an institutional cultural position than it was for a white man occupying a franchise star position. The gendered double standard that we identified in Section 5's analysis of the insurance policy theory operates here as well. Male performers can afford to destroy their brand equity because the market will reward them for the destruction. Female performers cannot, because the market will punish them. This asymmetry means that Pattinson and Zendaya arrive at the drama from fundamentally different trajectories, and the collision of those trajectories is itself a source of commercial value. Pattinson arrives as a performer who has earned the right to be disgusting, pathetic, and self-lacerating through a decade of systematic brand destruction. Zendaya arrives as a performer who has earned the right to be restrained, controlled, and emotionally opaque through a career of systematic brand maintenance. The film places these two trajectories in intimate proximity, in the same apartment, the same bed, the same wedding, and the tension between them generates a form of energy that is both emotionally compelling and commercially productive. The audience watches a man who is permitted to fall apart alongside a woman who is not permitted to fall apart, and the disparity between their degrees of licensed vulnerability becomes itself a commentary on the gendered structure of the cultural economy. This gendered disparity is visible in the transcript at nearly every turn. Charlie's emotional expressions are explosive, external, and physically manifest. He vomits, he cries, he shouts, he kisses another woman, he gets punched in the face. Emma's emotional expressions are contained, internal, and physically restrained. She sits, she listens, she deflects, she tries to manage the situation. When Emma does express external emotion, snapping at the driver, slapping Charlie, these moments are brief and quickly suppressed. The architecture of the performances mirrors the architecture of the performer's institutional positions. Pattinson has license to explode, Zendaya has license only to simmer, and the audience, whether or not they consciously recognize this asymmetry, feels it. They feel the unfairness of it. They feel the weight of the institutional constraints on Zendaya and the relative freedom of Pattinson's self-destruction. And this feeling, this intuitive recognition of gendered inequity in the distribution of expressive freedom, is another stream feeding the discourse metastasis engine. The casting of Pattinson also activates a specific form of intertextual resonance that amplifies the film's marketing architecture. Pattinson and Zendaya are not merely co-stars in the drama. They are co-stars in 3 films, releasing in 2026, the drama Dune Part 3, and Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. This unprecedented triple collaboration creates a cross-promotional network that multiplies the attention each film receives. Audiences who are drawn to the drama by nostalgia capital or discourse curiosity become aware of Dune Part 3 and The Odyssey. Audiences who are drawn to the blockbuster spectacle of Nolan or Villeneuve become aware of the drama. The 3 films function as a portfolio, a diversified set of cultural products that share a common asset, the Pattinson-Zendaya pairing, and that cross-promote each other through the mere fact of their coexistence in the same release calendar. This portfolio effect is not unique to Pattinson and Zendaya, but the scale of it in 2026 is historically unusual. 3 major films starring the same pair in the same year creates a saturation effect that keeps both performers in continuous public consciousness for the entire year. Every press tour, every red carpet, every interview, every social media post for any one of the 3 films generates attention that spills over to the other 2. The discourse metastasis engine operates across all 3 films simultaneously, with discussions of one film triggering discussions of the others. The portfolio effect transforms the individual marketing budgets of 3 separate films into a unified marketing infrastructure whose total impact is greater than the sum of its parts. From Pattinson's perspective, this portfolio effect represents the ultimate vindication of his anti-institutional branding strategy. The performer who spent a decade destroying his franchise identity is now starring in 3 major films in a single year, including 2 franchise entries, Dune, The Odyssey, and 1 A24 prestige drama. He has achieved something that the conventional wisdom said was impossible. He has destroyed and rebuilt his brand simultaneously. He has the art house credibility of a performer who has rejected commercial logic and the commercial reach of a performer who stars in the biggest franchises in Hollywood. He has, in the language of portfolio theory, achieved optimal diversification, exposure to both high-risk, high-return assets, his art house work, the drama, and low-risk, stable-return assets, his franchise work, Dune, The Odyssey, that together produce a risk-adjusted return that exceeds what either strategy could achieve alone. And the drama, sitting at the center of this portfolio, benefits from both dimensions. It benefits from Pattinson's art house credibility, which signals to the A24 audience that the film is a serious, challenging work of art. It benefits from Pattinson's franchise reach, which signals to the mainstream audience that the film features a globally recognized star. It benefits from his nostalgia capital, which draws the Twilight generation. And it benefits from his anti-institutional brand, which draws audiences interested in seeing a performer who is willing to dismantle himself on screen. Each of these benefits is a separate revenue stream, and together they produce a commercial outcome that is disproportionate to the film's production budget, its marketing spend, or its intrinsic artistic merit. The Twilight to Pattinson pipeline is not merely a career arc. It is a value creation engine, an 18-year project of strategic brand destruction and reconstruction that has produced, in the drama, its most commercially and artistically sophisticated return on investment to date. There is a character in the drama who receives less critical attention than the leads, but who performs, at a structural level, the most important function in the film's marketing architecture. That character is Rachel, played by Alana Haim. Rachel is Emma's maid of honor, Mike's wife, and the person whose reaction to Emma's revelation sets in motion the cascading social collapse that drives the film's second and third acts. Rachel is also, and this is the point that the critical discourse has largely failed to articulate, the film's primary engine of racialized discourse, the character whose behavior, when processed through the racial lens that Zendaya's casting activates, generates the most passionate, the most divisive, and the most commercially productive stream of audience debate. Rachel is not merely a supporting character. She is a mirror, a surface onto which the audience projects its own understanding of race, gender, moral authority, and the specific dynamics of how white women exercise power over black and biracial women in American social life. And the image that the mirror reflects depends entirely on who is looking into it. Let us begin with what the transcript reveals about Rachel as a character, because the specifics are essential to understanding how the racialized mirror operates. Rachel is introduced in the context of the wedding preparations. She is Emma's maid of honor, which positions her as Emma's closest female friend and primary social support. She is married to Mike, who is Charlie's best man. The two couples form a social unit, a foursome, that is the primary relational context for both the wedding and the revelation that disrupts it. Rachel's personality, as revealed through the transcript, is assertive, opinionated, and socially dominant. She directs conversations. She pushes people to confess things they do not want to confess. She tells Mike to share the dog story. She pressures Emma with, "Come on, give us something good, give us some hot tea." She is the social catalyst who creates the conditions for the revelation, the person who insists that the game of worst confessions continue until everyone has participated. This is a critical detail that the racialized mirror amplifies. Rachel does not merely react to Emma's revelation. She creates the conditions under which the revelation occurs. She pressures Emma to confess. She establishes the social expectation that everyone must participate. She frames the game as an exercise in mutual vulnerability. We all share our worst thing, and then we move on. But when Emma's worst thing turns out to be categorically different from everyone else's, when it exceeds the implicit boundaries of the game, Rachel does not extend the grace that the game's premise requires. She does not say, "Well, that is your worst thing, and we said we would accept it." She does not apply the same standard of contextual forgiveness that she applied to Mike's confession of using his girlfriend as a human shield, or to her own confession of locking a disabled child in a closet overnight. She applies a different standard. She draws a line that she did not draw for anyone else. And the question of why she draws that line, what makes Emma's confession categorically different from Rachel's own, is the question that the racialized mirror transforms into a discourse engine. For an audience that processes this scene without a racial lens, Rachel's reaction is straightforward moral outrage. Emma confessed to planning a mass shooting. Rachel has a cousin, Sam, who is in a wheelchair because of a shooting. Rachel's reaction is personal, visceral, and understandable. She is not punishing Emma for being black or biracial. She is punishing Emma for being a would-be mass shooter. The racial dimension is invisible because it does not exist in the screenplay. It exists only in the casting, in the fact that Zendaya is playing Emma and Alana Haim is playing Rachel. But for an audience that processes this scene through a racial lens, an audience that sees Emma as a black or biracial woman and Rachel as a white woman, the dynamics shift profoundly. Rachel's reaction stops being merely personal outrage and becomes legible as a specific, historically recognizable pattern of white feminine social control. This pattern has several components, each of which is visible in the transcript, and each of which maps onto well-documented dynamics in the sociological literature on race and gender. The first component is moral gatekeeping, the assertion of the right to define what is and is not morally acceptable, and to enforce that definition through social punishment. Rachel does not merely express horror at Emma's revelation. She assumes the authority to determine what the revelation means, how it should be interpreted, and what consequences it should carry. She says this is so disturbing, framing her emotional response as an objective moral assessment rather than a subjective reaction. She says, "You planned a school shooting," reducing Emma's complex, contextual, deeply personal confession to a categorical label. She does not ask questions. She does not seek understanding. She does not extend the kind of contextual analysis that would require acknowledging Emma's bullying, her isolation, her lack of therapeutic support, or the cultural environment that normalizes gun violence in America. She simply declares the verdict, "You are a school shooter, and that is who you are." This moral gatekeeping function maps directly onto the dynamics that black feminist scholars have identified in the operation of white feminism as a form of racial control. In the work of scholars like Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, and Kimberly Crenshaw, white feminism is analyzed not merely as a political movement, but as a system of social power that positions white women as the arbiters of feminine morality. White women within this system claim the authority to define what constitutes acceptable feminine behavior, what constitutes victimhood, and who deserves sympathy and protection. This authority is exercised most visibly when it is deployed against black and biracial women, who are subjected to a double standard in which their behavior is judged more harshly, their context is less likely to be considered, and their capacity for rehabilitation is less readily acknowledged. Rachel embodies this dynamic with a precision that is either deliberate on the part of the filmmakers or an emergent property of the casting decision. And, as we have argued throughout this case study, the distinction may not matter. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, the combination of Haim as Rachel and Zendaya as Emma creates a relational dynamic in which a white woman assumes moral authority over a biracial woman, judges her by a standard that is not applied equally to white transgressors, including Rachel herself, and mobilizes institutional and social power to punish her for a transgression that was confessed voluntarily, never executed, and occurred during adolescence. The second component of the racialized mirror is the weaponization of victimhood. Rachel does not assert moral authority in her own name. She asserts it in the name of her cousin Sam, a wheelchair-using mass shooting survivor. This is a crucial rhetorical move that the racialized mirror amplifies. By invoking Sam, Rachel positions herself not as a person who is judging Emma, but as a proxy for a victim who cannot speak for herself. This positioning is structurally powerful because it makes any challenge to Rachel's reaction appear to be a minimization of shooting victims' suffering. To say Rachel is overreacting is to appear to say shooting victims do not matter. To say Rachel should consider context is to appear to say shooting victims should forgive their attackers. Rachel has constructed a moral fortress in which she is unassailable because any attack on her position is redirectable to Sam, to the disabled body, to the wheelchair, to the lived reality of gun violence's consequences. The transcript captures this weaponization with devastating clarity. When Rachel first reacts to Emma's confession, she does not begin with her own feelings. She begins with Sam. You know my cousin is in a wheelchair because of a shooting, right? This is not a statement about Rachel's emotional state. It is a deployment of Sam as a rhetorical weapon, a move that transforms the conversation from a discussion of Emma's past to a referendum on Rachel's cousin's suffering. Emma cannot respond to this without appearing to dismiss gun violence. Charlie cannot defend Emma without appearing to dismiss gun violence. The invocation of Sam creates an asymmetry of moral authority that makes Rachel's position unassailable and Emma's position indefensible. Later in the film, Rachel escalates this weaponization. She tells Charlie that she needs to meet with Sam before the wedding to make sure that Sam is okay with all this. The implication is extraordinary. Rachel is seeking Sam's permission to attend Emma's wedding, as if Emma's adolescent ideation, a plan that was never executed, against a school that Sam did not attend, in a state where Sam does not live, constitutes a direct personal offense against Sam. This inflation of the harm, the expansion of Sam's victimhood to encompass a transgression that has no direct connection to Sam's experience, is a rhetorical device that black women in America encounter with specific frequency. The white woman who expands the definition of harm until it encompasses any behavior by a black woman that the white woman finds threatening, uncomfortable, or morally objectionable. The third component is the double standard. The racialized mirror makes visible the extraordinary disparity between how Rachel's own confession is treated and how Emma's confession is treated. Rachel locked a mentally disabled child in a closet in an abandoned RV in the woods. The child screamed. Rachel ran away. The child's father came looking for him. Rachel lied. A search party was organized. The child was found, but Rachel never told anyone what she had done. This is, by any reasonable moral measure, an act of genuine cruelty, an act that involved actual harm to an actual person, that was motivated by something Rachel cannot fully explain, I do not know what came over me, and that she concealed through active deception. And yet, this confession is treated by the group as a funny story. Mike laughs. Charlie laughs. Emma asks, what would you have done if they had not found him? And Rachel says she would have said something. A claim that her own narrative contradicts, since she had ample opportunity to say something and chose not to. The disparity is stark. Rachel's confession involves actual harm to an actual person. Emma's confession involves planned harm that was never executed. Rachel's confession is treated as a humorous anecdote. Emma's confession is treated as a moral emergency. Rachel's confession does not alter her social standing within the group. Emma's confession triggers a cascading social collapse that threatens her wedding, her friendships, and her relationship. The only variable that changes between the two confessions is the nature of the transgression, and the racial identity of the confessor, which the film never names, but which Zendaya's casting makes available as an interpretive frame. For an audience that does not activate the racial lens, this disparity reads as a function of the transgression's different magnitudes. Planning a mass shooting is worse than locking a kid in a closet. The disparity in response is proportional to the disparity in severity. This is a reasonable reading. It is supported by the text. But for an audience that activates the racial lens, the disparity reads differently. It reads as evidence that the magnitude assessment itself is racialized, that the group's judgment of what counts as severe is shaped by who is doing the confessing. White Rachel's cruelty is minimized. Biracial Emma's cruelty is maximized. White violence is impulsive and forgivable. Black violence is planned and definitional. The pattern is not conscious. No one in the scene says anything about race. But the pattern is there, in the differential treatment, in the asymmetric allocation of moral judgment, and the audience that can see it will generate discourse about it, discourse that feeds the marketing architecture that A24 has constructed. The fourth component is social mobilization. Rachel does not merely judge Emma, she acts on her judgment. She withdraws from the wedding. She calls Emma at night to say she is not coming. She tells Misha about Emma's secret, or at least the film strongly implies that she does. Since Misha is overheard at the wedding discussing a school shooting in hushed tones, she delivers a maid of honor speech that is laced with coded hostility, describing Emma as full of surprises and Charlie as a real cheerleader, phrases that function as public signals to anyone who knows the secret. She meets with Sam, her wheelchair-using cousin, in what appears to be a campaign to build a coalition of moral opposition to Emma. Each of these actions represents a form of social mobilization, the use of social networks, institutional relationships, and public platforms to punish a person who has violated the moral gatekeeper's standards. This pattern of social mobilization is one that black women in corporate America, in academic institutions, in social organizations, and in everyday life recognize with painful clarity. It is the pattern of the white woman who, upon encountering a black woman whose behavior she finds threatening or objectionable, does not simply express her displeasure and move on. She organizes, she tells other people, she builds a case, she marshals institutional support, she creates a social environment in which the black woman is isolated, suspected, and ultimately pushed out. This pattern has been documented extensively in organizational sociology, in studies of workplace harassment and exclusion, and in the lived testimony of black women across every sector of American professional and social life. And Rachel enacts it on screen with a comprehensiveness that is either remarkably astute social observation on the part of the filmmakers or a natural consequence of the racial dynamics that Zendaya's casting imports into the narrative. Let us now examine the philosophical implications of Rachel's function as a racialized mirror, because they connect to some of the deepest questions in moral philosophy about the nature of judgment, forgiveness, and the relationship between past and present identity. Rachel's position is, at its philosophical core, an essentialist position, the belief that a person's past actions reveal their essential nature, and that this essential nature is permanent and unchangeable. When Rachel says you planned a school shooting, she is not describing a historical event. She is making an ontological claim, a claim about who Emma is, not merely about what Emma did. The present tense is significant. Not you planned. You are a person who planned. The planning is not in the past. It is in the present because it is part of Emma's essence, and essence does not change. This essentialist position has a specific racial history in America. The belief that past behavior reveals permanent character, that a person who has done something bad is essentially a bad person, regardless of subsequent change, has been applied with particular force and particular frequency to black Americans. The criminal justice system's treatment of black defendants, the media's framing of black victims of police violence, searching for prior convictions, drug use, or behavioral infractions to retroactively justify the violence, the educational system's treatment of black students, the school-to-prison pipeline, in which behavioral infractions are treated as evidence of essential character rather than situational responses. All of these institutional patterns reflect an essentialist logic that is racialized in its application. White people who make mistakes are given the benefit of contextual interpretation. They were stressed. They were young. They did not mean it. Their brain was not fully developed. Black people who make the same mistakes are given the essentialist interpretation. They are dangerous, they are criminal, they are fundamentally flawed. Rachel's treatment of Emma reproduces this racialized essentialism within the intimate context of a friendship. Rachel does not say Emma made a terrible mistake when she was 15 and has since become a different person. She says Emma planned a school shooting, as if the planning is who Emma is. She does not engage with the contextual factors, the bullying, the isolation, the lack of therapeutic support, the cultural environment of normalized gun violence that Charlie tries to introduce into the conversation. She dismisses them. She says it is awful, not interesting. She refuses the contextual interpretation and insists on the essentialist one. And the question of whether this refusal is driven by genuine moral conviction, by personal trauma related to her cousin Sam, or by a racialized perception that assigns different levels of essential dangerousness to different bodies, is the question that the racialized mirror converts into discourse. The film is brilliant precisely because it does not answer this question. It leaves it open. It provides evidence for all three interpretations simultaneously, and it allows the audience to select the interpretation that aligns with their own racial literacy, their own moral framework, and their own experiential history. An audience member who has never experienced racialized moral gatekeeping will see Rachel as a righteous woman protecting her family. An audience member who has experienced it, who has been on the receiving end of a white woman's moral mobilization campaign, will see Rachel as a specific, recognizable, and deeply threatening form of social violence. Both readings are valid, both are supported by the text. And the collision between them, when it occurs on social media, in podcast discussions, in academic papers, and in private conversations, generates the discourse that the film's marketing architecture requires. There is one more dimension of Rachel's function that deserves analysis, and it concerns the specific way that Rachel's moral authority is constructed in relation to disability. Sam, Rachel's cousin, who is in a wheelchair because of a shooting, never speaks in the film. Sam is, as far as the transcript reveals, present in one scene, the restaurant encounter with Charlie, but functions primarily as a symbol rather than as a character. Sam is the embodiment of gun violence's consequences. Sam is the wheelchair. Sam is the moral trump card that Rachel deploys whenever her position is challenged. And Sam's silence, the fact that Sam never gets to express her own view of Emma's confession, never gets to decide for herself whether Emma's adolescent ideation constitutes a personal offense, is itself a form of erasure that disability studies scholars would immediately recognize. Rachel speaks for Sam. Rachel assumes the right to determine what Sam would feel, what Sam needs to be protected from, and what Sam's suffering means in the context of Emma's revelation. This appropriation of a disabled person's experience for the purposes of asserting moral authority is a well-documented dynamic in disability studies, where it is sometimes called inspiration appropriation or victimhood proxy, the use of a disabled person's suffering by an able-bodied person as a rhetorical device to advance the able-bodied person's agenda. Rachel is not protecting Sam. She is using Sam. Sam's wheelchair is not a person in Rachel's deployment of it. It is an argument. It is a shield. It is the moral infrastructure that makes Rachel's position unassailable. The intersection of race and disability in this dynamic adds yet another layer to the racialized mirror. Rachel, a white able-bodied woman, appropriates the suffering of a disabled person to punish a biracial woman for a transgression that the disabled person was not directly affected by. This triple intersection, race, gender, disability, creates a knot of moral complexity that generates enormous discourse because it activates multiple activist communities simultaneously. Disability rights advocates discuss the ethics of Rachel's appropriation of Sam's experience. Feminist scholars discuss the gendered dynamics of Rachel's moral gatekeeping. Race scholars discuss the racialized double standard in how confessions are evaluated. Each community generates its own discourse, and the discourses interact with each other in ways that compound the total volume of attention the film receives. Rachel is, in this sense, the most commercially valuable character in the drama, not because she generates the most screen time or the most audience sympathy, but because she generates the most discourse. She is the discourse catalyst, the character whose behavior activates the maximum number of unresolved cultural tensions simultaneously. She activates race through her differential treatment of Emma's confession, gender through her deployment of white feminine moral authority, disability through her appropriation of Sam's suffering, criminal justice through her essentialist position on forgiveness and rehabilitation, and feminism through her enactment of the white feminist exclusion dynamics that intersectional feminists have been documenting for decades. Each of these activations generates its own discourse stream, and each discourse stream feeds the metastatic marketing architecture that turns cultural tension into commercial value. The racialized mirror is, ultimately, the film's most sophisticated marketing device. It is more powerful than the trailer, more effective than the press tour, more productive than the wedding-themed promotional stunts. Because the racialized mirror does not generate a single unified marketing message. It generates a multiplicity of messages, different messages for different audiences, each message resonant with that audience's specific experiences, frameworks, and emotional investments. The mirror shows each viewer their own understanding of race, gender, power, and morality, reflected back at them through the specific dynamics of Rachel and Emma's relationship. And because what the mirror shows is deeply personal, connected to the viewer's own experiences of being judged, excluded, defended, or attacked along racial and gendered lines, the viewer's response is deeply engaged. They do not merely watch the film, they inhabit it. They bring their own histories into the theater and project them onto the screen. And when they leave the theater, they carry the film's questions with them, into their conversations, their social media posts, their arguments, their silences. The mirror does not stop reflecting when the credits roll. It reflects forever in every conversation about race and gender and forgiveness and moral authority that the viewer enters for the rest of their life. And each reflection is a unit of discourse. And each unit of discourse is a unit of marketing. And the film, sitting at the center of all of it, collects the revenue of a culture arguing with itself about the things it has never been able to resolve. Let us extend this analysis into one final domain that has not yet been addressed. The way Rachel's function as a racialized mirror connects to the broader political economy of white women's tears. In the sociological and critical race literature, the concept of white women's tears refers to the specific dynamic in which a white woman's expression of emotional distress, crying, expressing hurt, performing vulnerability, is used, whether consciously or unconsciously, to redirect attention from the harm being done to a person of color to the emotional state of the white woman. The mechanism operates through the cultural assumption that white women's emotions are more valid, more urgent, and more deserving of care than the emotions of people of color. When a white woman cries in a conflict with a black woman, the social group typically rallies around the white woman, comforting her, validating her distress, centering her experience, while the black woman's perspective, grievance, or suffering is marginalized or ignored. Rachel does not cry in the transcript, at least not in the scenes directly following Emma's revelation, but she performs the functional equivalent of white women's tears through what we might call white women's moral distress. She does not weep, she rages, she withdraws, she mobilizes, and the social group responds to her moral distress in exactly the way that the white women's tears dynamic predicts. They center Rachel's feelings, they worry about Rachel, they check on Rachel, they try to manage Rachel. Mike mediates between Rachel and Emma. Charlie goes to Rachel to plead Emma's case. The entire social system orients itself around Rachel's emotional state, and Emma, the person who made herself vulnerable by confessing the worst thing she has ever done, the person who is now exposed and defenseless, is left to manage her own distress without the social support that Rachel commands simply by being the aggrieved white woman. The transcript captures a particularly devastating instance of this dynamic in the scene where Charlie visits Rachel and Mike to advocate for Emma. Charlie tries to provide context for Emma's confession: her childhood friend who died, her lack of therapy, the environmental factors that shaped her adolescent ideation. Rachel's response is dismissive. Well, I am sorry she had to go through that, obviously. The word obviously performs enormous work here. It signals that Rachel acknowledges the suffering but considers it irrelevant, that she has heard the contextualizing information and rejected it. When Charlie then says he finds it kind of interesting, Rachel responds with incredulity. Interesting? Really? And then, when Emma arrives at the bookstore where Rachel works and tries to speak with her, Rachel uses a work obligation as an excuse to exit the conversation. They are asking if you can come approve that oblideck, a retreat into institutional authority that allows her to end the confrontation on her own terms. This pattern, acknowledge, dismiss, retreat into institutional authority, is a specific script that black women in professional and social environments encounter with devastating regularity. It is the script of the white woman who says, "I hear you," but communicates, "I do not care." It is the script of the white woman who uses institutional structures, workplace hierarchies, social obligations, family commitments, as escape hatches that allow her to avoid engaging with the substance of a black woman's experience while maintaining the appearance of reasonableness. Rachel never says anything overtly racist. She never says anything that could be identified as discriminatory. She simply refuses to engage, refuses to contextualize, refuses to extend the same grace that she received for her own confession, and deploys institutional and social power to enforce her refusal. And the audience, depending on their racial literacy, either sees this pattern or does not. Those who see it generate discourse about it. Those who do not generate different discourse about it. And both streams feed the metastatic marketing architecture. The maid of honor speech is perhaps the most sophisticated deployment of racialized social violence in the entire film. The transcript reveals Rachel standing before the assembled wedding guests and delivering a speech that is, on its surface, positive and supportive, but that is, for anyone who knows the context, saturated with coded hostility. She says, "Getting to know Emma, I have come to see how layered and complex she is, full of surprises like you would not believe." The phrase "full of surprises" is not a compliment. It is a coded reference to Emma's confession, a public signal that Rachel knows something about Emma that the audience does not, and that this something is not good. She continues, "Emma, you have found a very open-minded partner in Charlie. A real cheerleader, am I right?" The phrase open-minded and cheerleader are not praise for Charlie. They are accusations, coded references to Charlie's willingness to forgive Emma, framed as naivety or moral weakness rather than as love or grace. And she concludes, "To the happy, carefree couple, where carefree operates as the final coded insult, implying that Emma and Charlie are irresponsible, that their happiness is built on a foundation of moral evasion, and that their carefree attitude is itself a form of moral failure." The brilliance of this speech, from the perspective of the racialized mirror, is that it operates entirely through plausible deniability. Rachel has said nothing that could be identified as hostile. Every phrase is technically positive. Someone who does not know the context would hear a perfectly pleasant maid of honor toast. But someone who does know the context, and by the wedding scene, several characters at the event know or suspect the context, here's a systematic dismantling of Emma's social position, executed in public, with a smile, in front of everyone Emma loves. This is the specific form of violence that the critical race literature calls microaggression at the macro scale, the deployment of coded language, ambiguous framing, and plausible deniability to inflict social harm while maintaining the appearance of innocence. The commercial value of Rachel's maid of honor speech is immense, and it operates through the discourse metastasis architecture in a specific way. The speech generates a particular kind of audience response, the double take. Audiences watch the speech and feel uncomfortable, but may not immediately be able to articulate why. Then they process it. Then they discuss it. Then they debate whether Rachel's speech was hostile or supportive, whether the coded language was intentional or accidental, whether Rachel was being passive-aggressive or genuinely trying to be kind. This debate, this interpretive uncertainty, is the fuel of discourse metastasis. It generates posts, threads, videos, essays, and arguments that extend the film's cultural presence far beyond the theater. And the debate is irresolvable because the speech is designed to be ambiguous, because the racialized mirror reflects different images to different viewers, and because the fundamental question, was Rachel's behavior racially motivated, is a question that American culture has never been able to answer definitively about anything. Rachel is, in the final analysis, the most important character in the drama's marketing architecture. More important than Emma, more important than Charlie, more important even than Zendaya herself. Because Rachel is the character who converts the film's latent racial tension into active cultural discourse. She is the catalyst. She is the enzyme. She is the spark that ignites the discourse metastasis, chain reaction. Without Rachel, without a white woman who enacts a recognizable pattern of moral gatekeeping, victimhood weaponization, and social mobilization against a biracial woman, the film's racial dimension would remain latent, inert, commercially unproductive. Rachel activates it. Rachel makes it visible. Rachel makes it arguable. And the argument, as we have established throughout this case study, is the product. The film is merely the occasion for the argument, and Rachel is the occasion for the film. There is a company in the American entertainment industry that has achieved something that no marketing textbook predicted and no business school case study adequately explains. The company is A24, and what it has achieved is the transformation of a film studio into a discourse infrastructure, a permanent, self-sustaining mechanism for converting cultural provocation into economic value. A24 does not merely distribute films, it distributes arguments. It does not merely produce content, it produces the conditions under which content becomes contested, debated, dissected, and virally propagated across every platform in the contemporary media ecosystem. And the drama is not merely A24's latest release, it is the most sophisticated product to emerge from this discourse machine to date. The film that most completely embodies the company's operational logic and most transparently reveals the structural principles that make that logic work. To understand A24 as a discourse machine, we must first understand why traditional studio models fail to produce the kind of cultural engagement that A24 routinely achieves. Traditional studios, the legacy majors like Warner Brothers, Universal, Disney, Paramount, operate on what we might call a satisfaction model of audience engagement. They invest enormous sums in market research, test screenings, and audience analytics to determine what audiences want, and then they produce products designed to satisfy those wants as efficiently as possible. The satisfaction model is optimized for opening weekends. It seeks to generate maximum ticket sales in the shortest possible time by minimizing the friction between audience expectation and product delivery. The audience expects a superhero film. The studio delivers a superhero film. The audience is satisfied. The studio collects revenue. The transaction is clean, predictable, and forgettable. A24 operates on a fundamentally different model, what we have been calling throughout this case study the discourse metastasis model, but which we can now, in the specific context of A24's institutional strategy, refine into something more precise. A24 operates on a provocation model of audience engagement. The provocation model does not seek to satisfy audience expectations. It seeks to violate them. It does not seek to minimize friction between expectation and delivery. It seeks to maximize friction. It does not seek to produce products that audiences enjoy and forget. It seeks to produce products that audiences cannot stop arguing about, products that lodge themselves in the cultural conversation and refuse to be dislodged, generating attention, discourse, and economic value for weeks, months, and years after their initial release. The provocation model requires a fundamentally different relationship between the studio and its audience. In the satisfaction model, the audience is a consumer, a passive recipient of a product designed to meet their needs. In the provocation model, the audience is a participant, an active co-creator of the cultural meaning that the product generates. The studio provides the provocation, the audience provides the discourse. And the discourse is the actual product, the thing that generates cultural presence, media coverage, social media engagement, and ultimately, economic value. The film itself is not the product. The film is the catalyst. The product is the argument. A24 has been refining this model since its founding in 2012, and its filmography reads as a systematic exploration of the provocation model's possibilities. Hereditary provoked discourse about the boundaries of horror, how far a film can go in depicting the destruction of a family, how grief can shade into madness, how the sacred institution of motherhood can be corrupted into something monstrous. Midsummer provoked discourse about the aesthetics of violence, whether horror can occur in bright daylight, whether a cult can be simultaneously terrifying and seductive, whether a woman can find liberation in a structure of absolute control. Uncut Gems provoked discourse about the nature of addiction and the Jewish American experience, whether a protagonist can be simultaneously sympathetic and repulsive, whether the audience's anxiety can itself be a form of entertainment, whether a film can succeed by making the audience physically uncomfortable for 2 hours. Moonlight provoked discourse about black masculinity, sexuality, and the possibility of tenderness in environments of extreme violence. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once provoked discourse about immigrant experience, generational trauma, and the narrative possibilities of genre-bending multiverse storytelling. Each of these films was designed, at the level of casting, narrative structure, visual style, and marketing, to generate a specific form of cultural provocation that would produce a specific form of discourse. The drama represents the apotheosis of this model because it provokes discourse across more cultural categories simultaneously than any previous A24 release. As we have documented across the preceding 8 sections, the film activates race through Zendaya's polymorphic racial identity and Rachel's racialized moral gatekeeping, gender through the gendered dynamics of forgiveness, moral authority, and the differential treatment of male and female violence, gun violence, through Emma's confession and its intersection with America's ongoing school shooting epidemic, disability, through Sam's wheelchair and Rachel's appropriation of Sam's suffering, romance, through the deconstruction of the romantic hero archetype via Pattinson's anti-institutional performance, class, through the upper-middle-class Boston setting and its distance from the rural Louisiana environment of Emma's adolescence, forgiveness and criminal justice, through the film's central question of whether a person can be defined by something they planned but never did, and celebrity culture, through the metatextual resonance between Emma's institutional predicament and Zendaya's institutional cultural position. Each of these categories contains unresolved tensions in American society. Each activation produces discourse, and the simultaneous activation of all of them produces a discourse output that is exponentially greater than the sum of its parts, the compound effect described by the discourse metastasis equation from section 1. Let us now examine the specific marketing tactics that A24 deployed for the drama, because they reveal the provocation model in its most granular and sophisticated form. The marketing campaign for the drama was not a campaign in the traditional sense, a unified set of messages designed to communicate a consistent value proposition to a target audience. It was a narrative, a multi-chapter story that unfolded over several months, with each chapter designed to generate a specific form of discourse that would build anticipation for the next chapter. The first chapter was the engagement announcement. In December 2025, A24 placed what appeared to be a wedding announcement in the Boston Globe, a mock engagement notice for Emma Harwood and Charlie Thompson that revealed character details and plot information while maintaining the fiction of a real couple's real wedding. This was a provocation disguised as a marketing tactic disguised as a newspaper announcement. It provoked discourse about the boundaries between advertising and editorial content, between fiction and reality, between the film's world and the audience's world. People who encountered the announcement were genuinely confused about whether it was real. This confusion was not a failure of communication. It was the communication. The confusion generated discussion, and the discussion generated awareness. The second chapter was the wedding-coded press tour. Zendaya and her stylist Law Roach developed a thematic wardrobe for the press tour, organized around the wedding tradition of something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. At the Los Angeles premiere, Zendaya wore the white Vivienne Westwood gown she had first worn to the 2015 Oscars, something old. At the Paris premiere, she wore custom Louis Vuitton, something new. This fashion strategy was not merely aesthetic. It was a marketing device that generated its own media coverage independently of the film. Fashion journalists wrote about the dresses, celebrity culture outlets covered the wardrobe choices, social media users debated the symbolism. Each piece of coverage was a marketing impression that A24 did not pay for, generated by the fashion dimension of the press tour rather than by the film itself. The fashion coverage drew attention to the film without discussing the film's content, which meant that the school shooting revelation remained concealed until audiences were in the theater, preserving the bait-and-switch architecture that the discourse metastasis model requires. The third chapter was the Las Vegas Wedding Chapel. A24 opened a one-day pop-up wedding chapel in Las Vegas where real couples could get married in what was described as the A24 way. Alana Haim served as DJ Zendaya, made a surprise appearance as a witness. There were branded souvenirs, including the Edward Cullen hoodie described in Section 7. This event was pure experiential marketing, a physical experience designed to generate social media content. Couples who got married at the chapel posted about it. Media outlets covered the event. The social media content extended the wedding narrative that A24 had been building since the Boston Globe announcement, deepening the audience's association of the film with romantic joy, celebration, and love. This association was, of course, a setup for the bait and switch, the revelation that the film is not a romantic comedy, but a dark exploration of violence, guilt, and moral judgment. But the setup had to feel genuine. The wedding chapel made it feel genuine. It made the audience invest emotionally in the romantic narrative so that the betrayal of that narrative would generate maximum discourse. The fourth chapter was the poster evolution. The film's marketing posters traced a visual arc that paralleled the film's narrative arc. Early posters showed Emma and Charlie warmly lit, laughing, visually coded as a couple in love. Later posters shifted the visual register. The lighting became harsher. The expressions became more strained. The romantic coding gave way to something more ambiguous. The final poster showed Pattinson battered and bloody, while Zendaya looked on with an expression that communicated irritation more than concern. This visual arc was a form of slow-release provocation, a gradual escalation of visual dissonance that signaled to attentive audiences that the film was not what the earlier marketing had promised. The escalation generated its own discourse. People posted the posters side by side. They speculated about what had changed. They began to suspect that the film contained a twist, which generated anticipation that increased opening weekend demand. The fifth chapter, and the most controversial, was the concealment of the school shooting revelation. A24 made the deliberate decision not to reveal the film's central plot twist in any marketing material. Journalists who attended early screenings were instructed not to mention it. Trailers, posters, and press materials presented the film exclusively as a wedding romance. This concealment strategy was a calculated provocation, a bet that the gap between marketing promise and theatrical delivery would generate more discourse than a conventional marketing campaign that accurately represented the film's content. The bet paid off spectacularly. March for Our Lives criticized the marketing as misleading. Tom Mauser, father of a Columbine victim, publicly condemned the film. These criticisms generated national media coverage that A24 could not have purchased at any price. And the media coverage generated audience curiosity that drove ticket sales. The concealment strategy converted moral outrage into marketing fuel, a conversion that is only possible within the provocation model, where negative attention is as commercially valuable as positive attention, because all attention feeds the discourse metastasis engine. This 5-chapter marketing narrative reveals the operational principles of the A24 discourse machine with clarity that verges on transparency. The principles are these. First, never market the product. Market the conversation about the product. The engagement announcement, the press tour, the wedding chapel, the post-revolution, none of these marketed the film directly. They marketed the cultural context around the film, the wedding, the romance, the fashion, the celebrity. The film was marketed by implication, by association, by the discourse that the cultural context generated. This principle is the practical application of the discourse metastasis theory. The product is not the film, but the argument about the film, and the marketing should be designed to generate the argument rather than to sell the film. Second, never resolve ambiguity. Maintain it. The concealment of the school shooting revelation, the racial ambiguity of Zendaya's casting, the tonal instability of the film itself, all of these are forms of maintained ambiguity that generate discourse precisely because they resist resolution. A marketing campaign that resolved the ambiguity, that told the audience what the film was really about, what the racial dynamics really meant, what the moral framework really was, would collapse the discourse by providing a definitive answer. The provocation model requires irresolution because irresolution is the fuel of discourse. People argue about things they cannot resolve. They stop arguing about things they can. Third, activate as many cultural categories as possible simultaneously. The drama activates race, gender, gun violence, disability, romance, class, forgiveness, celebrity culture, and the nature of moral judgment. Each activation generates its own discourse stream. The streams interact, producing compound effects that exceed the sum of their parts. A film that activated only one category, only race or only gun violence, would generate a single stream discourse that would exhaust itself relatively quickly. A film that activates 8 or 9 categories simultaneously generates a multi-stream discourse that sustains itself indefinitely because each stream reinforces the others. Fourth, weaponize the bait and switch. The gap between marketing promise and theatrical delivery is not a communication failure. It is a discourse generator. The bait draws the audience in. The switch generates the emotional response, confusion, outrage, fascination, moral distress, that powers the discourse. The wider the gap, the more powerful the discourse. A24 has made the bait and switch a central feature of its marketing strategy across multiple films, but the drama represents its most ambitious and most commercially successful deployment. Fifth, let the audience do the marketing. The most cost-effective form of marketing is marketing that the audience creates and distributes themselves. Social media posts, podcast episodes, think pieces, TikTok videos, academic papers, dinner table arguments. A24's provocation model is designed to produce this self-generated marketing by giving the audience something to argue about. Every post, every podcast, every argument is a marketing impression that A24 did not pay for. The total marketing value of this audience-generated content dwarfs the value of A24's paid marketing spend, which is why A24 can compete commercially with studios whose marketing budgets are 10 or 20 times larger. These 5 principles constitute the operational manual of the A24 discourse machine, and they represent a genuine paradigm shift in the economics of cultural production. The traditional model assumed that marketing was a cost, an expense that firms incurred to generate awareness and drive sales. The provocation model reconceptualizes marketing as an investment in the construction of cultural objects that generate their own marketing through the discourse they provoke. The return on this investment is not linear, more spend equals more awareness, but exponential. More provocation equals exponentially, more discourse equals exponentially more awareness. This exponential return structure is why A24, a company with a fraction of the resources of the major studios, consistently produces films with cultural footprints that rival or exceed those of films with 10 times the budget. The drama is A24's masterwork, the film that most completely embodies the discourse machine's operational logic and most transparently demonstrates its commercial power. It is not A24's best film. The critical consensus is clear that it has significant structural weaknesses, that its screenplay lacks development and momentum, that its treatment of its central theme is more provocative than profound. But it may be A24's most important film from a business strategy perspective, because it demonstrates that the discourse machine can generate disproportionate cultural and commercial impact even when the underlying product is imperfect. The machine does not require great film, it requires a loaded one. It requires a film that is constructed to activate cultural tensions, generate discourse, and sustain irresolution. The drama is that film, and its commercial performance, its box office returns, its media coverage, its social media engagement, its position in the ongoing cultural conversation, validates the discourse machine's logic with a clarity that should concern every traditional studio executive in Hollywood. The implications extend beyond the film industry. The A24 discourse machine is a model for any organization that operates in the attention economy, any organization whose success depends on generating and sustaining public attention. Political campaigns, consumer brands, media companies, nonprofit organizations, educational institutions, all of them face the same fundamental challenge: how to generate attention in an environment of infinite competition and finite audience capacity. The A24 discourse machine offers a solution. Do not try to satisfy the audience. Provoke them. Do not try to resolve cultural tensions. Activate them. Do not try to control the narrative. Generate the conditions under which the narrative controls itself. And do not try to market the product. Market the argument about the product, and let the argument sell the product for you. This is the new economics of attention. It is the economics of provocation over satisfaction, of irresolution over clarity, of discourse over consumption. It is the economics that the drama embodies and that A24 has spent a decade building. And it is the economics that will define the next generation of cultural production, not because it is morally superior to the satisfaction model, not because it produces better art, but because it produces more attention per dollar invested, and in the attention economy, attention is the only currency that matters. The A24 discourse machine is not merely a business strategy, it is a cultural institution, a permanent feature of the American media landscape that has fundamentally altered the relationship between producers and audiences, between products and markets, between art and commerce. It has demonstrated that a studio can be more than a distributor of content. A studio can be a distributor of arguments. A studio can be a platform for provocation. A studio can be, in the deepest and most literal sense, a discourse machine, a device that takes cultural raw material, processes it through a specific set of operational principles, and outputs attention, engagement, and revenue in quantities that defy the conventional wisdom about what is possible in the entertainment industry. A24 built this machine. The drama is its finest hour, and the culture, whether it knows it or not, is running on A24's engine now. Let us now examine the deeper structural logic of A24's institutional identity, because the company itself functions as a category context perception engine, and this meta-level application of our own framework reveals something genuinely new about how brand identity operates in the attention economy. A24 is not merely a distributor of provocative films. A24 is a brand that transforms the perceived quality of the films it distributes by changing the categorical frame through which audiences evaluate them. A film released by Warner Brothers, or Universal, is evaluated against the categorical expectation of a major studio release, a category associated with high production values, commercial calculation, and artistic compromise. A film released by A24 is evaluated against a fundamentally different categorical expectation, a category associated with artistic integrity, cultural provocation, and the willingness to prioritize vision over commercial safety. The exact same film, released through these two different distribution channels, would receive different critical evaluations, different audience responses, and different box office trajectories. Not because the film is different, but because the categorical frame is different. This is the Buck-Ease effect applied to a film studio. A24 is not competing in the same category as the major studios. It has created its own category, the category of the prestige indie provocateur. And within this category, it has established a categorical expectation that makes even its weaker films seem more interesting, more culturally relevant, and more worthy of attention than they would be if released through a conventional channel. The drama benefits enormously from this categorical positioning. As we have acknowledged throughout this case study, the drama has significant artistic limitations. Its screenplay lacks development, its second half sags, its treatment of its central theme is more provocative than profound. If the same film had been released by a major studio, these limitations would likely dominate the critical conversation, and the film would be categorized as a well-cast but structurally flawed drama. But because it is an A24 film, the limitations are contextualized within a different critical framework, a framework that values provocation, ambiguity, and cultural engagement over narrative polish and structural rigor. The category context. Perception engine transforms structural weakness into stylistic choice. narrative flabbiness into deliberate pacing, and thematic superficiality into tonal instability that invites audience interpretation. This categorical advantage is self-reinforcing. Each provocative film that A24 releases strengthens the categorical expectation that A24 films are provocative, which increases the discourse generated by the next provocative film, which strengthens the categorical expectation further. The cycle is virtuous from A24's perspective and nearly impossible for competitors to replicate, because the categorical advantage is built on a decade of accumulated brand equity. A new studio cannot simply decide to become the next A24. It must build the categorical expectation from scratch, which requires years of consistent provocative output, years of cultural presence, years of audience trust. A24's brand is, in this sense, a form of institutional capital, an asset that generates returns through the categorical transformation of everything the institution touches. There is a further dimension of A24's discourse machine that concerns its relationship to the broader media ecosystem and its function as what network theorists call a hub node. In network theory, a hub node is a node in a network that has a disproportionately large number of connections, a node through which information flows more frequently and more efficiently than through other nodes. A24 functions as a hub node in the cultural discourse network. When A24 releases a film, the release activates a pre-existing network of cultural commentators, film critics, podcast hosts, social media influencers, academic scholars, and general audience members who are primed to engage with A24 products. This network does not need to be built from scratch for each release. It exists permanently, maintained by A24's brand identity, and activated automatically by each new release. The hub node function means that A24 films receive a disproportionate share of cultural attention relative to their budgets, their screen counts, and their intrinsic artistic merit, because the attention flows through the hub, and A24 is the hub. The drama's performance within this hub network is illustrative. The film opened on approximately 3,000 screens, a wide release by indie standards, but modest by major studio standards. Its opening weekend gross of approximately $26 million worldwide is respectable but not remarkable in absolute terms. But the cultural footprint of the film, measured in media coverage, social media engagement, podcast episodes, think pieces, academic discussions, and sustained public discourse, is wildly disproportionate to its commercial performance. This disproportionality is the signature of the hub node effect. The film's cultural impact is amplified by the A24 brand's hub function, which channels attention from across the cultural discourse network into the film, and then redistributes that attention outward through the discourse streams that the film generates. We should also examine how A24 has leveraged what we might call community identity marketing, the creation of a consumer identity that is organized around the studio brand rather than around individual films. A24 fans do not merely watch A24 films. They identify as A24 fans. They wear A24 merchandise. They follow A24 on social media. They discuss A24's release calendar with the anticipatory enthusiasm that other consumers reserve for sports teams or fashion brands. This community identity is a marketing asset of extraordinary value because it means that each new A24 release has a built-in audience that will not only consume the product, but will actively market it through their own social networks. The A24 fan does not need to be convinced to see the drama. They need to be informed that it exists, and they will do the rest, buying tickets, posting about the film, arguing about its themes, and generating the discourse that drives additional ticket sales from the broader audience. This community identity is itself a product of the provocation model. A24 fans identify with the brand because the brand represents a specific set of cultural values: intellectual curiosity, aesthetic sophistication, willingness to engage with uncomfortable material, rejection of mainstream commercial calculation. By consistently producing films that embody these values, A24 has created a community that sees its film consumption as an expression of identity rather than a mere entertainment choice. This identity-based consumption is the most powerful form of brand loyalty because it is self-reinforcing. The more films the fan consumes, the more deeply they identify with the brand, and the more deeply they identify with the brand, the more films they consume. The community identity also creates social pressure to consume. A24 fans feel an implicit obligation to see each new release in order to maintain their identity within the community, to participate in the discourse, to remain current with the cultural conversation that the community is organized around. The drama exploits this community identity with particular effectiveness because it is positioned at the intersection of A24's core audience, prestige indie consumers, and a much larger mainstream audience, Zendaya fans, Pattinson fans, romance consumers. The A24 community identity draws the core audience, which generates the initial wave of discourse. The mainstream audience, attracted by the star power and the wedding marketing, encounters this discourse and is drawn into the film by curiosity. The collision between these two audiences, the core audience that expects provocation, and the mainstream audience that expects romance, generates a second wave of discourse that is even more productive than the first, because it is driven by the gap between two fundamentally different sets of expectations. The core audience says, of course, this is not a simple romance. It is A24. The mainstream audience says, wait, what did I just watch? And the argument between these two positions sustains the discourse for weeks after the film's release. This collision of audiences is not accidental. It is the strategic deployment of what we might call audience arbitrage, the exploitation of expectation differentials between audience segments to generate discourse. A24 markets the film to two audiences with fundamentally different expectations, knowing that the gap between those expectations will produce conflict, and knowing that conflict produces discourse, and knowing that discourse produces revenue. This is the same principle that we identified in Section 1 as discourse metastasis, but applied at the audience level rather than at the thematic level. The film does not merely activate cultural tensions, it activates audience tensions, the tension between the core A24 audience and the mainstream audience, between the audience that expects provocation and the audience that expects satisfaction, between the audience that is in on the joke and the audience that is the joke's target. A24's discourse machine is, in the final analysis, not a marketing strategy. It is a philosophy of cultural production, a coherent worldview about the relationship between art, commerce, and public attention that has been systematically developed and rigorously applied over the course of more than a decade. The philosophy holds that the most valuable cultural products are not the ones that audiences enjoy the most, but the ones that audiences argue about the most. It holds that provocation is a more efficient generator of attention than satisfaction. It holds that ambiguity is a more durable source of engagement than clarity. It holds that the audience is not a consumer but a co-creator, and that the most commercially effective form of marketing is marketing that the audience creates themselves. And it holds that a studio brand can function not merely as a mark of quality, but as a categorical frame, a lens through which audiences perceive and evaluate cultural products, and that shapes those perceptions as powerfully as the products themselves. The drama is the purest expression of this philosophy that A24 has yet produced. It is a film that is designed, at every level of its construction, casting, narrative, marketing, distribution, to generate the maximum volume of discourse with the minimum expenditure of resources. It is a discourse machine within a discourse machine, a product of A24's institutional logic that embodies that logic so completely that studying the film is, in effect, studying A24 itself. And A24 itself is, as we have now demonstrated, a new kind of institution, an institution that has transcended the traditional category of a film studio and become something for which we do not yet have an adequate name, a discourse infrastructure, a provocation protocol, a cultural engine, a machine that runs on arguments and outputs attention and revenue. The drama is this machine's latest product, but the machine itself is A24's true masterpiece, a permanently operating system for converting cultural tension into economic value, and the most important innovation in the business of entertainment since the invention of the studio system itself.